The Industrial Revolution is often remembered for its grand machines, steam engines, and the rapid transformation of society. But beneath the stories of towering factories and bustling cities, the revolution was a quiet, gradual process of shift that unfolded over decades and affected the lives of everyday people in ways both subtle and profound. It was a time when the world began to change, not with a sudden crash, but with the steady hum of machines and the slow transformation of land, labor, and society. In the mid-18th century, Britain stood at the forefront of this transformation. People moved from rural areas to towns and cities, hoping for better wages and opportunities. The workers who were the backbone of this revolution paid the price with their health, safety, and sometimes their lives. The economic landscape began to change, and with it, the very fabric of society. In the old agricultural system, wealth was largely tied to land ownership, but they also represented a world that was rapidly leaving behind the old ways. As factories sprang up across Britain and later the rest of Europe and the United States, the landscape was transformed. People were drawn into the cities to work in the factories, leaving behind their rural way of life. This shift brought about a great social upheaval. The rise of industrial society meant that new social classes emerged. The same advancements in production and efficiency that benefited some also contributed to exploitation, harsh working conditions, and social unrest. Workers demanded better wages, better hours, and better living conditions. Unions began to form, seeking to negotiate for rights that would help workers survive in an increasingly industrialized world. On one hand, there was the growing class of industrialists, those who owned and profited from the machines. The streets were filled with the noise of the machines, the smell of burning coal, and the heavy weight of progress. Some viewed the changes as a symbol of human ingenuity, a triumph of the machine over nature, while others felt the loss of a simpler, more agrarian life. On the other hand, there was the working class, whose labor powered the revolution, but whose living conditions were often horrific. But what would the consequences of this revolution be for the generations to come? Would the advancements in technology and industry continue to bring about progress, or would the workers who powered these machines find themselves further exploited by those who profited from their labor? This gap between the rich and the poor became a defining feature of the Industrial Revolution. The rise of railroads and canals connected cities and regions, while the advent of steamships made travel faster and more accessible. As factories produced goods more efficiently and cheaply, they made consumer products more accessible to a broader range of people. Goods that were once reserved for the elite became available to the middle class, expanding the scope of consumer culture. The rise of mass production made everything from clothing to tools and luxuries more affordable, and as living standards began to improve, even the poor could aspire to better lives. But as the Industrial Revolution advanced, the source of wealth shifted to capital money that could be invested in machinery, factories, and infrastructure. In the countryside, the open field systems that had sustained generations of farmers were replaced by more intensive, mechanized farming techniques. Landlords began to enclose land, pushing tenants off and consolidating their holdings. While some prospered, others were left homeless and landless, forced to join the ranks of the growing urban poor. The new class of industrialists, who owned the factories and controlled the means of production, became the new aristocracy, replacing the landowners who had dominated society for centuries. Yet they were often met with long hours, grueling work, and poor living conditions. The rise of the factory system was fueled by the labor of men, women, and children who worked under harsh conditions for little pay. Many embraced the idea that through hard work and innovation, anyone could rise to the top, regardless of their social background. The narrative of the self-made man became central to the ethos of the Industrial Revolution. It was an idea that resonated deeply in a world that was rapidly becoming more complex and interconnected. But as much as the Industrial Revolution promised opportunity, it also made clear the disparities in wealth and power that would grow as industry spread. Families lived in overcrowded tenements, where pollution from factories filled the air, and diseases like cholera and smallpox spread rapidly. The rise of the textile industry, the invention of the steam engine, and the development of new transportation networks such as canals and railways were the early markers of this great shift. But while these developments were revolutionary, they didn't always make headlines or spark immediate public attention. For many, life continued, much as it had for centuries, farming the land, working in craft shops, and living in small, close-knit communities. The industrial changes were often seen in the background, quietly growing in the form of factories, workshops, and new inventions. At first glance, the impact of these developments might not have been obvious. The first steam engines, for example, were used primarily to pump water from mines. But as new machines, like the spinning jenny and the power loom, were introduced, textile production skyrocketed. These machines could do the work of many human hands, turning raw materials into finished products much faster than ever before. The rise of the factory system soon followed, as more and more workers flocked to industrial centers to work in increasingly mechanized environments. These machines, designed by Thomas Newcomen and later improved by James Watt, were rudimentary. They were loud, clunky, and often inefficient. Yet, over time, these engines would prove to be the key to unlocking a new world, a world where energy could be harnessed in ways never before imagined. Similarly, the textile industry began as a relatively small-scale operation, focused on weaving wool and cotton in domestic homes. However, for the workers themselves, this new system was anything but glamorous. The great irony of the Industrial Revolution was that while it promised progress and prosperity, it often came at the expense of those least able to protect themselves. But even as these workers toiled in factories, a larger shift was taking place that would reshape society. The idea of capitalism itself was evolving. The early industrialists saw themselves as part of a new, self-made class. The new factories and machines that transformed agriculture, textiles, and transportation were powerful symbols of the revolution. Yet, with all these advancements, the very fabric of daily life was changing in ways that were often difficult to understand. The mechanization of agriculture had another consequence. It created a massive demand for labor. But amid all the upheaval, there was also something quietly transformative happening. However, this was not a seamless process. But for now, the revolution was still in its early stages. As the Industrial Revolution began to take hold, it was clear that the world was changing in ways that no one had fully anticipated. As the Industrial Revolution continued to unfold, its impact on society became more pronounced. The noise of machines, the rise of factories, and the expansion of transportation networks were not only transforming the landscape, but also the very structure of society itself. The idea of the self-made man, a central element of the revolution, began to shape how people viewed success, labor, and progress. But as this new world emerged, it also created stark inequalities and challenges that would reverberate for generations. The transformation of cities, urbanization and its discontents, the growth of factories, and the need for labor led to the rapid urbanization of Britain and other industrializing nations. As the wealthy industrialists grew richer, the divide between the haves and the have-nots became stark. The middle class, consisting of merchants, managers, and skilled workers, began to gain influence. But the poorest in society were left to struggle with minimal support. With the rise of factories, women began to enter the workforce in large numbers. However, their lives were often marked by inequality and exploitation. Factory work for women, much like for children, was grueling and poorly paid. Women were typically assigned to spinning, weaving, and other repetitive tasks that were viewed as less skilled, and thus earned them less money than their male counterparts. Their work was seen as secondary to that of men, and their lower wages reflected their social status. Even as industrialization expanded, women were typically confined to roles that kept them subjugated. The traditional land-based economy was replaced by one where capital and industry dominated. The wealth that had once been tied to land ownership was now concentrated in the hands of those who controlled the factories, mines, and railroads. The rise of the middle class was a direct result of this shift. and their labor was seen as less valuable than that of men, contributing to the growing gender inequality of the time. Their rise was due in part to the demand for skilled labor in the new industrial world. Many members of the middle class were concerned with maintaining their newfound status and sought to distance themselves from the poor and the working class. This growing division between classes would have profound implications for the future of the labor movement, as the divide between the owners and the workers continued to widen. As cities grew, so did the need for people to manage businesses, oversee the operation of factories, and provide services to the expanding population. The middle class enjoyed a higher standard of living than the working class, but they were also often involved in the day-to-day management of the industries that were built on the labor of the poorest. Small villages gave way to crowded cities, which sprang up almost overnight around industrial centers. These new urban areas became magnets for the poor and landless, many of whom had been displaced from rural life due to changes in agriculture and the rise of enclosure movements. In factory towns, women often formed close-knit networks, helping one another through the harshness of life. Many of the early labor movements were driven by the efforts of women, particularly in the textile and garment industries. They began organizing strikes and protests to demand better wages, shorter working hours, and improved conditions. What started as small changes in machinery, factories, and labor practices would set the stage for broader social movements, struggles for rights, and questions about fairness and equality. But would these changes lead to a fairer world for those who powered the revolution? Or would the inequalities grow deeper with the rise of the new industrial elites? These early movements, though small, laid the groundwork for the larger labor movements that would emerge later in the 19th and 20th centuries. For many, the promise of work in the factories was the only option for survival, drawing them to cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool in Britain, or Pittsburgh in the United States. In these environments, women worked long hours in cramped and often dangerous conditions. In textile factories, the constant hum of machinery, the dense air, and the risk of injury were part of everyday life. The introduction of machinery was meant to increase efficiency, but it also created an environment where workers were expendable. Women who worked in these mills were often subject to abusive treatment from factory owners or managers, who saw them merely as tools to operate machines, rather than as human beings. But the life that awaited them was far from the idealized version they had imagined. The conditions in these growing urban centers were often grim. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were employed in factories, mines, and mills, often working up to 12 to 16 hours a day for meager pay. The physical toll on their small bodies was severe. Many suffered from physical deformities, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Yet, the factory owners saw children as valuable assets, cheap labor that could be easily managed and exploited. The poor working conditions and low wages led to early forms of labor unrest. But for many, it was a necessary evil, as they had no other means of support. Overcrowding was rampant, with families squeezed into small, dilapidated homes, sometimes sharing living space with other families. These tenements were poorly constructed and lacked basic sanitation, leading to the spread of disease. Cholera, typhoid, and smallpox ran rampant in the densely packed cities, where there was little access to clean water or effective waste disposal. Public health crises became common, and the population of cities swelled as the industrial economy continued to draw people in. Child labor became a significant issue, as factory owners turned to young, unskilled workers to operate the machinery. The working class was expanding rapidly, but its members were often invisible to the growing middle and upper classes. Women in the Industrial Revolution. The silent workers. While much attention has been given to the role of men in the Industrial Revolution, the lives of women in this era were also being transformed. Textile mills and coal mines were the two main industries that employed large numbers of women. Despite these challenges, working-class women began to develop a strong sense of community and solidarity. But despite their crucial role in the economy, women's contributions were often underappreciated. The rise of the middle class, the changing nature of work and wealth as the factory system spread. The nature of work and wealth began to change. The middle class consisted primarily of merchants, bankers, and professionals like doctors, lawyers, and teachers, while the middle class benefited from the growth of the industrial economy. They were also affected by the increasing tension between the classes. As the Industrial Revolution continued to expand, the lives of the working class, women, and the emerging middle class were forever shaped by the forces of industrialization. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, the social, economic, and cultural changes it brought about began to ripple out far beyond the factories and mines. The consequences of industrialization were profound, not only transforming the way people worked and lived, but also changing the landscape of society itself. New ideologies emerged, new social classes were formed, and the labor movement began to take shape in ways that would influence the course of history for decades to come. The rise of factory towns. The new industrial landscape. By the early 19th century, industrial towns and cities were spreading rapidly across Europe and the United States. These new urban centers were built around the factories that powered the Industrial Revolution. The factory system, which was becoming more widespread, offered little in terms of upward mobility. For many, there was no way to escape the grueling work or the poverty that came with it. As workers began to organize, they demanded better wages, shorter working hours, and improved working conditions. Strikes and protests were common, as workers sought to pressure factory owners and the government into addressing their concerns. The first trade unions were formed to provide a unified voice for workers, helping them negotiate for better pay, safer working conditions, and reasonable hours. Over time, workers began to win key victories, such as minimum wage laws, workplace safety regulations, and shorter work. These successes were hard-won and came at a great cost. Many workers paid with their lives or livelihoods for the progress that would eventually come. But these unions faced constant opposition from factory owners, who saw them as a threat to their profits. In some cases, workers were able to unionize, forming collective bargaining units that gave them some leverage against factory owners. The rise of the factory system placed immense strain on family life, as long working hours left little time for family interaction. Children who had previously helped their parents with household chores or worked on family farms were now sent to work in factories, often alongside their mothers. This led to a decline in childhood education and the undermining of traditional family structures. The shift from agriculture to industry, the rise of factories, and the exploitation of labor all left a lasting imprint on society. The working class bore the brunt of industrialization's cost, and it would be many years before their voices were heard and their rights were recognized. Yet, the struggles of these workers laid the foundation for the social movements that would shape the future of labor, women's rights, and social justice. As the years passed, the changes brought about by industrialization led to the development of the modern economy, where technology and industry would continue to play a central role. The very fabric of family life and gender roles began to change as industrialization spread. Women, who had traditionally been responsible for domestic work and child, now found themselves working outside the home, often in harsh conditions. Would the benefits of the industrialized world outweigh the human costs of its rise? And as we look at the present world, can we learn from the mistakes and successes of the past to build a more equitable future in the textile industry? For example, women and children were employed to operate the spinning jennies and other machines, which required dexterity and patience. However, many still face significant obstacles. Social expectations often prevented them from achieving the same levels of professional success as men. Despite these obstacles, the changes in gender roles set the stage for the women's suffrage movement and the eventual fight for equal rights that would shape the 20th century. This new form of employment brought about changes in the family dynamic. Women, especially in working-class families, began to contribute financially to the household, challenging traditional norms that confined women to domestic spheres. The factory system required both men and women to participate in the workforce, and as more and more women found jobs in factories, their roles within the family and society began to shift. By halting production workers could force the factory owners to listen to their demands. The first major strikes in the Industrial Revolution occurred in the textile industry, where workers fought for better pay and shorter working hours. In many cases, strikes were brutally suppressed, with factory owners using private militias or local police forces to break up protests. Despite this, the labor movement continued to gain momentum. The growing divide between the industrialists, those who controlled the factories, and the workers created a sense of injustice that would fuel labor movements in the years to come. The economy was booming, with factories producing textiles, steel, and other goods at a scale never seen before. They saw labor as a resource, one to be exploited for profit. As a result, the working conditions in factories were appalling. Long hours, low wages, and dangerous environments were the norm. In textile mills, workers were exposed to hazardous chemicals, while in mines, they risked their lives to extract coal and precious metals. In factories, machinery was often unprotected, leading to injuries and deaths. Workers had little recourse in the face of such dangers. They were disposable, easily replaced by the next wave of laborers eager to find work. Railroads expanded, providing faster transportation of goods and people. But behind the facade of progress, the reality of life in these industrial centers was often grim. Overcrowding became a problem. As workers flooded into towns looking for jobs, entire families lived in small, cramped homes, with little regard for hygiene or sanitation. Tenement houses, which were hastily built to accommodate the growing population, were often poorly constructed and offered little protection from the harsh weather. In some cases, entire towns were created specifically for the workers who would staff the factories. Factory towns, with their factory owners, workers, and managers, became the new social and economic hubs of the industrial age. At first glance, these towns appeared to be thriving. The factory owners, while enjoying vast wealth, were more interested in increasing production than in improving conditions for their workers. But, despite these harsh realities, many workers found themselves stuck in a cycle of poverty and dependence. The birth of labor movements, a struggle for rights and dignity, the injustice and inequality experienced by workers eventually led to the rise of the labor movement, one of the most significant social movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The earliest labor movements were often violent and disruptive, as workers fought for their rights in the face of overwhelming opposition. One of the most powerful tools that workers used in their struggle was the strike. While violent uprisings and strikes characterized the early days of the labor movement, the movement gradually became more organized and peaceful. The social impact of the Industrial Revolution, changing family life and gender roles. The changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution were not limited to the economic or political spheres. In many cases, the shift in gender roles was subtle. The change in gender roles was not without its challenges. For women in the middle and upper classes, the Industrial Revolution offered new opportunities in fields like teaching, nursing, and clerical work. The enduring legacy of the Industrial Revolution. As the Industrial Revolution unfolded, its influence spread across the globe, shaping not just the economy, but also the very way people lived, worked, and thought. But even as the revolution ushered in an era of unprecedented progress, it also created inequality and hardship for many. The question that remained, and one that would define the Industrial Revolution in hindsight, was, what price was society willing to pay for progress? The medieval monastery was a place of quiet devotion, where the world outside seemed distant and often irrelevant to the lives of those who lived behind its walls. For centuries, monks and nuns led lives of dedication to God, following strict rules of prayer, labor, and silence. Monks and nuns lived in communities that were organized around religious orders, each following specific rules or charters. Some, like the Benedictines, lived according to the rules set forth by Saint Benedict of Nursia, emphasizing a life of prayer, work, and study. It was about maintaining a rigorous daily routine, often dictated by the sound of the monastery's bells. Inside, monks lived according to a strict hierarchy, with each individual given a specific role. The abbot, who was elected by the community, oversaw the entire monastery, while the monks and lay brothers took care of the various duties. Each day began and ended with prayers. The liturgy of the hours, a series of prayers, recited at specific times throughout the day. Young boys from noble families would often be sent to monasteries to receive an education, learning Latin, the scriptures, and the basics of reading and writing. In some cases, monasteries held land given to them by kings or nobles, making them integral to the feudal system. The church, through its could exert considerable influence over local lords, and the wealth of these institutions made them valuable players in the power struggles of the Middle Ages. In addition to religious studies, many monasteries became centers for scientific inquiry. In some stories, monks were depicted as devout, self-sacrificing individuals who were dedicated to God and the well-being of society. In others, they were shown as greedy or hypocritical, more interested in their own comforts than in serving the people they swore to help. In both cases, the monastery was a symbol of a deeper spiritual conflict between the life of action and the life of contemplation. As Europe moved into the Renaissance and the Reformation, monastic life was increasingly criticized. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin challenged the practices of the Catholic Church, including the monastic system. Despite the growing skepticism toward the monastic system, some religious orders like the Jesuits continued to thrive, adapting to the changing times and focusing more on education and missionary work than on seclusion. It was a center of learning, healthcare, and agriculture that helped to shape the world around it. While the history of the monastic life may seem distant, the impact of these institutions can still be felt today, as they laid the foundations for many aspects of modern education, medicine, and community life. In some cases, monasteries were disbanded, their lands seized, and their wealth reached. The rise of the Protestant Reformation had a profound impact on the role of monasteries in society, especially in areas that became predominantly Protestant. Monks contributed to the fields of astronomy, mathematics, and agriculture, often introducing new ideas to their communities, who retreated into the deserts of Egypt and Syria to live solitary lives of prayer and meditation. By the time of the Middle Ages, however, monasticism had become an institution that was deeply embedded in the daily life of medieval society. The monastery was no longer just a place of individual retreat. It was a vital community that supported the social, political, and economic fabric of the Middle Ages. Many monasteries were destroyed, their lands sold off to the highest bidder. This led to the destruction of much of the monastic tradition in England and marked the beginning of a new era in both religious life and social structure. The rest of the day was spent in manual labor, often farming the surrounding land, tending to animals, and performing tasks that kept the monasteries. They played a central role in agriculture, education, and healthcare. In a time when life expectancy was short and disease was rampant, the monastery was often the only place to find medical care. The solitude and quiet that characterized monastic life seemed at odds with the turbulent, sometimes violent world beyond the monastery's walls. It was common for outsiders to view the monk's life as somewhat eccentric or even unrealistic. The vow of poverty, the isolation, and the emphasis on contemplation over action often left people wondering whether the monks were truly helpful to society, or if they were simply escaping the realities of life. Monks, who studied herbal remedies and basic medical practices, became the primary healthcare providers in rural areas. Some monasteries even had pharmacies, where medicinal herbs were grown and prepared for those in need. The monks lived on the produce they grew and the goods they made, whether it was food, clothing, or other items necessary for their survival. Others, like the Cistercians, focused more on manual labor and self-sufficiency, reflecting a stricter interpretation of the original monastic vows. The monastery was both a sanctuary and a center of learning, but its true role in medieval society was far more complex than the peaceful image it often conveys today. Monasteries first began to appear in the early centuries of the Christian era, but by the Middle Ages, they had become an essential part of life in Europe. For the medieval world, monasteries were crucial in several key ways. They were places of education and preservation of knowledge, as monks transcribed ancient texts and maintained libraries. At a time when literacy was limited, monks were among the few who could read and write, and many of the classics of Western civilization, Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Christian scriptures were preserved through their efforts. Monasteries became places of intellectual pursuit, not just religious observance. But the life of a monk or nun was not simply about studying or praying. The monastery itself was often a self-contained world. Its walls offered protection not just from the outside world, but also from the distractions and dangers of secular life. The role of monasteries in medieval society. Monasteries were more than just places of religious retreat. They were at the heart of medieval society. In the absence of widespread public education, monastic schools became centers of learning, where both religious and secular knowledge were taught. Monasteries also had a political influence. They were often landowners and had significant wealth, which gave them power in the medieval world. The quiet power of monasticism. Despite their importance, monasteries were often viewed with a degree of suspicion by the outside world. This tension between secular and religious life was often reflected in the literature and writings of the time. The Christian ideal of monasticism, in which one renounced worldly concerns to focus on God, had been modeled after the desert fathers of the early church, the decline and transformation of the monasteries by the late Middle Ages. However, the role of monasteries began to shift. In England, King Henry VIII famously dissolved the monasteries in the 16th century, seizing their land and wealth, in what became known as the dissolution of the monasteries. In other parts of Europe, monasteries continued to play an important role, although their influence waned over time. The medieval monastery, quiet, secluded, and seemingly untouched by the outside world, was much more than just a place for monks to live in peace. As the medieval monastery continued to shape the religious, economic, and intellectual life of Europe, it became clear that these institutions were not just places of solitude and devotion, but also centers of cultural exchange, learning, and social control. The monasteries were key players in the larger context of medieval society, influencing everything from agriculture and trade to the preservation of knowledge and the formation of social hierarchies. Monastic influence on agriculture. The monastery as a self-sustaining economy. One of the most significant roles that monasteries played during the medieval period was their involvement in agriculture. The vast lands that many monasteries controlled allowed them to create self-sustaining agricultural systems, with monks often engaging in the cultivation of crops, the raising of livestock, and the management of forests. Monasteries often operated mills, breweries, and bakeries, becoming economic hubs in their regions. These records, passed down through generations, became an important part of the legacy of the monastic system, influencing future generations of farmers and These activities allowed them to generate wealth, which they could use to fund their religious activities, support the poor, and maintain their properties. The task of preserving ancient texts, especially those of the Greeks and Romans, was taken up by the monks, who meticulously copied manuscripts by hand. These monks weren't just copying religious scriptures like the Bible, but also the writings of Plato, Aristotle, as well as the works of ancient scientists and mathematicians, and simplicity, while others, such as the Benedictines, put a strong emphasis on the scholarly and intellectual aspects of monastic life. This diversity of focus across different orders meant that some monasteries became renowned for their learning and libraries, while others were known for their agricultural advancements or their charitable work. Monasteries were hierarchical institutions where authority flowed from the top down. The abbot, who was the head of the monastery, held considerable power within the religious community. Beneath him were the monks, each assigned a specific role, from overseeing the gardens to managing the scriptorium. The lower ranks of the monastic hierarchy, the lay brothers and novices often, had less power and influence. In social life of the Middle Ages, it is clear that its impact on European history cannot be overstated. These institutions helped shape not only the religious landscape but also the development of agriculture, trade, and education. Yet, despite their vital role in the preservation of knowledge and the maintenance of society, monasteries were not without their challenges. The rise of monastic orders and their relationship with the outside world was constantly evolving. But as the medieval period progressed, the monasteries continued to stand as pillars of a changing society. The life of the lay brother was one of hard labor, while the life of the monk was more centered around prayer, study, and intellectual pursuits. This division within the monastery reflected the broader social inequality of the time, where those of noble birth often held more privileges than those born into poverty. The lay brothers, often lower-ranking members of the community, worked in the fields, tended animals, and carried out tasks that required more physical labor. In the absence of large universities or libraries, monasteries were the primary preservers of classical knowledge. It is often said that, without the efforts of these monastic scribes, many of the texts from antiquity would have been lost to history. In many cases, the monasteries were the only places where books could be found, as literacy was rare among the general populace. Benedictine monasticism, for example, followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which outlined a daily schedule of prayers, work, and study. The wealthy and landed aristocracy often provided patronage to the monasteries, donating land and funds. In return, these noble families would receive prayers for their souls and the souls of their ancestors. This close relationship between the monastery and the nobility helped ensure that monasteries remained financially stable and able to carry out their mission. The monks lived a life of obedience, chastity, and poverty, devoting themselves entirely to God. The monastery was meant to be a place of refuge from the distractions and sins of the world, but it was also a place where order and discipline were maintained. While the monks focused on their spiritual duties and manual labor, they were also deeply involved in the practical aspects of farming, developing techniques and systems that improved agricultural productivity. In fact, some of the most advanced agricultural techniques of the time were pioneered by monastic communities. These libraries contained not just religious texts, but also works on medicine, astronomy, law, and history. Some of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Middle Ages, such as the scholastic movement, which sought to reconcile faith with reason, were developed in the monastic setting. Monasteries, therefore, were not just spiritual havens, they were also centers of intellectual development in a time when education was largely the domain of the clergy. Crop rotation, the use of irrigation, and the improvement of animal breeding were all introduced by monks working to ensure the self-sufficiency of their monasteries. These lands were not only essential for the survival of the monasteries themselves, but also for the surrounding rural communities that depended on the monasteries for economic stability. Monasteries often functioned as landlords, managing large estates with the labor of serfs or peasants who worked the land in exchange for protection and a place to live. But the land wasn't just used for farming. Many monasteries developed trade networks, selling their surplus goods such as wool, grains, and crafted goods to nearby towns. Monasteries also became centers for the development of agricultural knowledge, as monks recorded their farming techniques, crop yields, and the best practices for cultivation and detailed the preservation of knowledge. Monasteries, as libraries of the medieval world. While monasteries were primarily religious institutions, they also became repositories of knowledge during the medieval period. The monastic scribes spent long hours in scriptoriums, copying religious texts, philosophical works, and scientific treatises. The abbey libraries, often large and impressive, became centers of learning, where monks studied texts, debated ideas, and taught younger monks. However, not all monasteries were equally focused on preserving knowledge. Some monastic orders, like the Cistercians, focused more on manual labor. The monastery and social structure, a reflection of medieval society. The monastic system also mirrored and reinforced the social structures of medieval Europe. The strict rules governing daily life within the monastery were designed to maintain order and discipline. The social structure within the monastery mirrored the broader social hierarchy of medieval Europe. However, not all members of society were treated equally within the monastic system, as the medieval monastery played a central role in the religious, intellectual, As the medieval monastery continued to shape the religious, economic, and intellectual life of Europe, it became clear that these institutions were not just places of solitude and devotion, but also centers of cultural exchange, learning, and social control. The monasteries were key players in the larger context of medieval society, influencing everything from agriculture and trade to the preservation of knowledge and the formation of social hierarchies. Monastic influence on agriculture. The monastery, as a self-sustaining economy, one of the most significant roles that monasteries played during the medieval period was their involvement in agriculture. While the monks focused on their spiritual duties and manual labor, they were also deeply involved in the practical aspects of farming, developing techniques and systems that improved agricultural productivity. Many monasteries developed trade networks, selling their surplus goods such as wool, grains, and crafted goods to nearby towns. These records, passed down through generations, became an important part of the legacy of the monastic system, influencing future generations of farmers and monasteries often operated mills, breweries, and bakeries, becoming economic hubs in their regions. These activities allowed them to generate wealth, which they could use to fund their religious activities, support the poor, and maintain their properties. The task of preserving ancient texts, especially those of the Greeks and Romans, was taken up by the monks, who meticulously copied manuscripts by hand. These libraries contained not just religious texts, but also works on medicine, astronomy, law, and history, and simplicity, while others, such as the Benedictines, put a strong emphasis on the scholarly and intellectual aspects of monastic life. This diversity of focus across different orders meant that some monasteries became renowned for their learning and libraries, while others were known for their agricultural advancements or their charitable work. Some of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Middle Ages, such as the scholastic movement, which sought to reconcile faith with reason, were developed in a monastic setting. Benedictine monasticism, for example, followed the rule of Saint Benedict, which outlined a daily schedule of prayers, work, and study. The monks lived a life of obedience, chastity, and poverty, devoting themselves entirely to God. The lower ranks of the monastic hierarchy, the lay brothers and novices, often had less power and influence. The life of the lay brother was one of hard labor, while the life of the monk was more centered around prayer, study, and intellectual pursuits. This division within the monastery reflected the broader social inequality of the time, where those of noble birth often held more privileges than those born into poverty. The monastery was meant to be a place of refuge from the distractions and sins of the world, but it was also a place where order and discipline were maintained. And social life of the Middle Ages, it is clear that its impact on European history cannot be overstated. These institutions helped shape not only the religious landscape, but also the development of agriculture, trade, and education. Yet, despite their vital role in the preservation of knowledge and the maintenance of society, monasteries were not without their challenges. The rise of monastic orders and their relationship with the outside world was constantly evolving. But as the medieval period progressed, the monasteries continued to stand as pillars of a changing society. Monasteries, therefore, were not just spiritual havens. They were also centers of intellectual development in a time when education was largely the domain of the clergy. The wealthy and landed aristocracy often provided patronage to the monasteries, donating land and funds. In return, these noble families would receive prayers for their souls and the souls of their ancestors. This close relationship between the monastery and the nobility helped ensure that monasteries remained financially stable and able to carry out their mission. Monasteries were hierarchical institutions where authority flowed from the top down. The abbot, who was the head of the monastery, held considerable power within the religious community. Beneath him were the monks, each assigned a specific role, from overseeing the gardens to managing the lay brothers, often lower-ranking members of the community, worked in the fields, tended animals, and carried out tasks that required more physical labor. In many cases, the monasteries were the only places where books could be found, as literacy was rare among the general populace. In fact, some of the most advanced agricultural techniques of the time were pioneered by monastic communities. These monks weren't just copying religious scriptures like the Bible, but also the writings of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, as well as the works of ancient scientists and mathematicians. In the absence of large universities or libraries, monasteries were the primary preservers of classical knowledge. It is often said that, without the efforts of these monastic scribes, many of the texts from antiquity would have been lost to history. Crop rotation, the use of irrigation, and the improvement of animal breeding were all introduced by monks working to ensure the self-sufficiency of their monasteries. The vast lands that many monasteries controlled allowed them to create self-sustaining agricultural systems, with monks often engaging in the cultivation of crops, the raising of livestock, and the management of forests. These lands were not only essential for the survival of the monasteries themselves, but also for the surrounding rural communities that depended on the monasteries for economic stability. Monasteries often functioned as landlords, managing large estates with the labor of serfs or peasants who worked the land in exchange for protection and a place to live. But the land wasn't just used for farming. Monasteries also became centers for the development of agricultural knowledge, as monks recorded their farming techniques, crop yields, and the best practices for cultivation and detailed the preservation of knowledge. Monasteries, as libraries of the medieval world. While monasteries were primarily religious institutions, they also became repositories of knowledge during the medieval period. The monastic scribes spent long hours in scriptoriums, copying religious texts, philosophical works, and scientific treatises. The abbey libraries, often large and impressive, became centers of learning, where monks studied texts, debated ideas, and taught younger monks. However, not all monasteries were equally focused on preserving knowledge. Some monastic orders, like the Cistercians, focused more on manual labor. The monastery and social structure, a reflection of medieval society. The monastic system also mirrored and reinforced the social structures of medieval Europe. The strict rules governing daily life within the monastery were designed to maintain order and discipline. The social structure within the monastery mirrored the broader social hierarchy of medieval Europe. However, not all members of society were treated equally within the monastic system, as the medieval monastery played a central role in the religious, intellectual. Throughout history, the concept of time has been a constant undercurrent shaping the world we live in. Yet, it was not always as precise or as uniform as it is today. The invention of the mechanical clock and the system of measuring time with ever-increasing precision redefined the way people lived, worked, and interacted with the world around them. The clock ushered in a new era of punctuality, productivity, and order that would shape civilization in ways both intended and unintended. The most common method was the sundial, an instrument that used the position of the sun's shadow to mark the hours of the day. Ancient civilizations, like the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, developed sundials to divide the day into fixed intervals. However, this method was dependent on the sun and could not function at night or during cloudy days, limiting its reliability. As the monasteries grew, so did the need for greater precision in keeping time. It wasn't just about marking the hours anymore. It was about scheduling. However, by the 13th century, Europe was on the brink of a timekeeping revolution. The first true mechanical clocks were created in the monasteries of Italy, France, and England. These early clocks were powered by weights and gears, marking a major shift from the reliance on natural elements like the sun or water, and ensuring that each monk knew exactly when to perform a prayer, a task, or a meal. This gear-based system regulated the release of energy from the weighted pendulum or wheel, controlling the movement of the clock's hands. In towns and cities, clocks provided a shared sense of time and structure for all citizens. The bell ringing at the top of the hour was a signal to workers, merchants, and citizens alike that it was time to start, stop, or change their work. No longer was it acceptable to wake up with the sunrise and sleep after sunset. As work hours became standardized, the idea of personal time was also shaped by the mechanical clock. What was once a natural rhythm, guided by the sun and seasons, became something artificially controlled. No longer was the day dictated by natural forces. It was dictated by machine and schedule. Time was something to be spent in work, on productivity, and eventually on leisure. We live in a world of precise schedules, where every moment is accounted for and managed. While the clock has allowed for greater efficiency, it has also led to stress, overwork, and a sense that we are always running out of time. The very tool that was invented to bring order to the chaos of life has contributed to a new kind of chaos, where people feel as though they can never catch up with the ticking hands of the clock. The 24-hour workday, the division of the week, and the calendar year are all products of the revolution in timekeeping that began with the invention of the mechanical clock. And as we continue to live in a world governed by the measurement of time, what role will time play in our future? People began to live in response to the clock's ticking, rather than following the natural rhythms of light and dark, day and night. With the rise of factory work and industrial production, time became synonymous with efficiency and profit. The working day, regulated by the clock, was divided into hours, and workers were expected to adhere to this rigid schedule. The clock became not just a tool for organizing daily life, but also a tool for controlling and measuring productivity. It became a commodity, something that could be measured, scheduled, and divided into manageable parts. The escapement mechanism was revolutionary because it allowed the clock to measure time consistently and accurately. Industrialization, which would come later in the 18th and 19th centuries, demanded even more precise timekeeping to organize the growing factories and work schedules. Clocks allowed work to become more efficient and predictable, as workers followed shifts and factory owners could more accurately gauge production. Before this, timekeeping devices were either inconsistent or relied on manual intervention to reset them. The need for something more accurate led to the eventual invention of the mechanical clock. These early models were often installed in the towers of churches or cathedrals, where the bells rang at regular intervals to mark the passing of time for the townspeople. As their lives were organized around the canon of the hours, the need for precision in timekeeping was critical. The monks needed to be able to start their prayers at exact times, and the mechanical clock allowed them to do just that. This necessity drove the demand for better and more accurate timekeeping devices. These church clocks became the central timekeepers in medieval towns, and the sound of the bells would be a constant reminder to the townspeople of the structure that time could impose on their lives. Before the mechanical clock was invented, timekeeping was an unreliable and often fluid concept. Water would flow steadily from one container to another, and the level of water in the second container would indicate the passage of time. This method was more reliable than the sundial, as it worked in both daylight and darkness, but it was still quite crude and inefficient by modern standards. Days were measured by the movement of the sun, and months by the phases of the moon. The monks in these religious communities needed precise times for their liturgies to series of prayers, chants, and rituals that performed throughout the day. In order to organize these rituals, the monasteries began experimenting with more reliable forms of timekeeping. The hours were largely an abstract concept, not tied to machines or fixed schedules, but more loosely defined by natural rhythms: when the sun rose, when the sun set, and when the workday was over. However, the rise of the clock in the Middle Ages changed everything. Time before the clock. How people measured time before the mechanical clock. Humans relied on a mix of natural indicators to mark the passage of time. The water clock, also known as the clepsydra, was another device used by ancient cultures to measure time. Throughout the Middle Ages, monasteries played a central role in developing more systematic approaches to timekeeping. Water clocks and sundials were used in the early days, but they were not sufficient for the demands of monastic life. The advent of the mechanical clock, revolutionizing timekeeping. The story of the mechanical clock's invention is somewhat murky, as different cultures and societies contributed to its development over several centuries. One of the key features of the early mechanical clocks was their escapement mechanism. The earliest mechanical clocks were not as portable or as precise as today's clocks, but they marked a significant advancement. Monasteries, especially in the Benedictine and Cistercian orders, played a major role in the development of the mechanical clock. Clocks and the rise of the towns. The town clock soon became an important feature in many medieval communities, marking not just the hours of prayer, but also the workday. With the advent of clocks, time itself became regulated, a clear departure from the more fluid concept of time that had existed before. It was also during this time that people began to structure their personal lives around the clock. The cultural shift. Time as a commodity. The invention of the clock marked a profound change in how society viewed time. As the Industrial Revolution took hold, it solidified this view of time. The legacy of the clock, paving the way for modern life. Today, clocks and time govern almost every aspect of our lives. But this shift didn't come without consequences. The rigid structure that the clock imposed on daily life has shaped our modern world in ways both positive and negative. The question now remains, how did something as simple as the invention of the clock lead to such profound changes in the structure of human life? The mechanical clock did not merely mark the passage of time. It transformed society. By the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, the invention and widespread use of clocks began to redefine how people perceived and interacted with time. In the context of daily life, time was no longer a broad, abstract concept that became something that could be quantified, divided, and measured. The introduction of the clock also heralded the development of modern systems of work, commerce, and even social interaction, with each moment of the day being accounted for and standardized. Clocks in the Renaissance. The birth of precision. By the time of the Renaissance, mechanical clocks were becoming more sophisticated, and their use expanded beyond just monasteries and churches. Public clocks became common in town squares, signaling the growth of cities that were moving towards the beginnings of modernity. In the medieval world, labor was often tied to natural rhythms. Agriculture was dictated by the seasons, and many trades operated on a more informal schedule. The factory system, which emerged alongside mechanized production, depended on workers adhering to specific hours. Factory owners used clocks to regulate shifts, ensuring that the workforce was available at the exact times needed for production. The idea of working from dawn to dusk, with set start and end times, became normalized. As the clock's tick dictated the rhythm of daily life, it also signaled the rise of the capitalist economy, where time was a commodity to be traded and maximized. The pace of life quickened, and with it, the pressure to remain on schedule. To keep up with the tick of time, people began to live by the clock, organizing their lives in small units of minutes and hours, rather than following natural rhythms or personal inclinations. The invention of the telephone, the electric light bulb, and later, the computer all demanded the continued precision of time. This level of accuracy has become fundamental to modern technology, from the synchronization of communication networks to the coordination of global finance. The evolution of the clock has reached a point where time is not just measured, but it plays a critical role in maintaining the functioning of the modern world. In the 20th century, the development of the atomic clock further advanced our ability to measure time with incredible accuracy, leading to advancements in communications, satellite navigation, and global positioning systems. The question arises, what does it mean to live in a world where every moment is accounted for? From the simple gears of early timepieces to the precision of modern atomic clocks, time has shaped the course of human civilization in ways both profound and subtle. As we continue to live in a society governed by the relentless ticking of the clock, we must ask, what role does time play in our future? And how will we continue to balance its influence over our lives? Are we truly free, or have we become slaves to the very thing that we once sought to master, the measurement of time? Punctuality became a virtue, tardiness a social failing. The clock established an order that dictated the flow of the day and separated time into strict categories of work, rest, and play. But the arrival of clocks, particularly in factories and workshops, began to impose a rigid structure on labor. The clock has allowed humanity to achieve extraordinary feats, But it has also created a world where time is seen as a resource to be consumed and exploited. In a world dominated by the tick-tock of the clock, we are always racing against time, trying to maximize productivity, earn more, and accomplish more in less time. This shift laid the groundwork for the rise of capitalism in the modern world. These clocks, which were placed in towers, gave the entire town a shared sense of timer synchronization that was crucial for the development of markets, trade, and municipal governance. The Renaissance saw the introduction of the pendulum clock by Christian Huygens in the 17th century. Each moment had to be accounted for, with workers expected to be productive during each minute of their shifts. The concept of efficiency, brought about by the clock, became a driving force in capitalist societies. Railroads, for example, needed standardized time schedules to ensure the safe and timely operation of trains. As transportation networks expanded across the globe, precise timekeeping became critical to coordination. The introduction of time zones in the late 19th century was a direct result of the need to standardize time for train schedules, and it marked the final transformation of time into a global commodity. Workers were paid for their time, not their skill or output, creating a new model where quantity mattered more than quality. The clock encouraged a system where productivity could be measured and tracked in ways that had never been possible before. The pendulum was a simple but revolutionary addition, allowing for greater accuracy in timekeeping. This advancement laid the foundation for modern timepieces, and the ability to measure time with such precision had a lasting impact on the development of navigation. Astronomy. It was a period when the pursuit of knowledge and the refinement of instruments were accelerating, and the clock stood at the center of this transformation. This development marked a turning point. The precision of the pendulum clock brought about not only a new understanding of time, but a new era in scientific experimentation and engineering. As astronomers, scientists, and navigators began to rely on these precise timepieces, clocks became indispensable tools in measuring longitude, calibrating telescopes, and ensuring the accuracy of scientific observations. The pendulum clock's ability to keep consistent time was unparalleled at the time. Clocks and the rise of capitalism. Time as a commodity. As clocks became more reliable and commonplace, they began to change the very nature of work. The Industrial Revolution was a period in which the clock's role in society became central. In this new world of factory labor, time was no longer a flexible resource. Clocks, in the modern world, a new reality of punctuality and efficiency. With the Industrial Revolution and the continued development of timekeeping, the clock became ubiquitous. Clocks became central to every aspect of modern life. Work schedules, school hours, shopping hours, and even leisure time all became governed by the clock. The global impact. Time and technology. As technology continued to evolve, so did the clock. The atomic clock, which measures time based on the vibration of atoms, is so precise that it is used to define the second itself. The clock as a symbol. Modern society's relationship with time. The clock, once a simple tool used to mark the hours of the day, has become a symbol of modern society's relationship with time, one that is both liberating and oppressive. As we continue to live in a world dominated by the quantification of time, the invention of the clock marked a pivotal moment in human history, one that redefined the way we perceive time and our place in the world. As we move deeper into the modern era, it becomes clear that the invention of the mechanical clock had implications that extended far beyond its use as a timekeeping device. The clock, which began as a simple tool for regulating the day, became a symbol of an emerging modernity, reshaping society, technology, and even personal identity. The relentless march of time, now accurately measured and universally agreed upon, began to govern not just work, but also leisure, relationships, and the rhythms of daily life. As factories and industrial centers sprang up across Europe and the United States, the clock became the tool that organized the workday. On the one hand, the industrial age brought more job opportunities, but on the other, it tied people to a rigid schedule dictated by the clock. The laborer's day was structured, often from dawn to dusk. with the ringing of the factory bell marking the start and end of work. Each moment of the day became precious, to be carefully accounted for. As workers lived in a world that revolved around the demands of the machine, trade unions and workers' movements began advocating for shorter workdays, safer working conditions, and better pay, fighting for the rights of workers to have control over their time. It was a tool that kept workers tethered to the factory, unable to enjoy the fullness of life outside of their labor. It shifted from being a tool of productivity and control to becoming a symbol of the fight for freedom from overwork, freedom to enjoy personal time, and the ability to choose how one's time was spent. The gradual shift towards a more balanced work-life structure was part of the ongoing struggle to define the role of time in the lives of the working class. In response to this, movements like the labor strikes and the push for workers' rights centered on the demand for more leisure time, a concept that had been foreign to many before the industrial age. For the first time in history, people around the world were required to coordinate their schedules based on a shared understanding of time. The idea of punctuality became more ingrained in global cultures, as adherence to time was necessary to maintain economic growth and trade. Time, which had once been an abstract idea, became a global currency, something to be measured, spent, and managed. As international travel became more common and businesses expanded into different parts of the world, the clock allowed for smoother coordination across time boundaries. The famous slogan, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will, became a rallying cry for workers during the labor movements of the 19th century, particularly in Europe and the United States. Factory owners saw time as an asset, one that could be maximized for profit. In some cases, the pace of the factory work became so intense that workers faced both mental and physical exhaustion. As technology continues to advance, timekeeping devices have become increasingly sophisticated. Smartwatches, global positioning systems, and online calendars have made it easier than ever to track time and schedule our lives. But with these advancements come new challenges. Will technology allow us to free ourselves from the constraints of time? Or will it only serve to further entrench the cycle of productivity and efficiency? The clock, once a tool of efficiency and organization, began to symbolize a deeper psychological conflict. The constant pressure to be on time. The clock, once a tool for organization, now seems to dictate our lifestyle and well-being. But will we be able to reshape our relationship with time, finding a balance between the pressure to achieve and the need for rest? Time management became an industry unto itself, with countless books, seminars, and tools devoted to helping individuals make the most of every moment. While the clock continues to be an essential tool that organizes work, life, and leisure, it also represents the constant pressure to do more, to achieve more, and to never waste a moment. People were encouraged to maximize productivity, multitask, and optimize their schedules, leading to a hyper-structured life that could leave little room for relaxation or reflection. As society became more fast-paced and consumer-driven, people found themselves increasingly tired. The demand for productivity, the pressure to meet deadlines, and the need to fit more into each day created a culture of overwork and stress. Long hours were often the norm, with little regard for the worker's health or well-being. The division of time between work, rest, and personal life became a challenge for many. Technological advancements in communication and transportation brought about new demands for the rise of airlines, global commerce, and telecommunications made it imperative to not only measure time precisely, but also to coordinate across vast distances. Time zones, introduced in the late 19th century by Sir Sandford Fleming, became the foundation for a global time system that allowed the world to run on a synchronized clock. And the clock stood as a constant reminder of the time they spent working in many cases, the time they lost. The factory floor became divided by hours, and the efficiency of the workers was directly measured by how many units could be produced in a given amount of time. The clock gave us a shared sense of time, but it also helped create a world in which time itself became a commodity. The clock in the Industrial Revolution, pushing the boundaries of time. The Industrial Revolution was perhaps the first true test of the clock's power over human lives. For the working class, this was both a blessing and a curse. Workers had to adhere to a strict schedule, ensuring that their time was spent efficiently. The clock in social movements, the fight for time and rights, the growing influence of the clock, especially in industrial societies, eventually gave rise to labor movements that sought to gain control over time. The clock, as an instrument of industrialization, was now also seen as a symbol of oppression. As the work week was slowly reduced and labor laws began to improve, the clock was redefined once again. Time and the birth of the modern world. A new relationship with the clock. With the dawn of the 20th century, the role of the clock shifted again. Time zones created a new framework for understanding time, as it was no longer limited to local or regional perceptions. At the same time, as the world became more connected, the workday and workweek were becoming more standardized across industries and countries. The clock in personal life. The quest for balance. As the modern world progressed, the relationship between time and personal life became more complicated. Despite the advances in technology and the promise of leisure brought about by the reduction of the workweek, the pressure to maximize time and achieve more often left people feeling like they were running out of time. In this modern world, time has become we measure it in work hours, commute times, and leisure hours, and the boundaries between these have become increasingly blurred. The future of time, beyond the clock. Looking ahead, the question remains, how will our relationship with time continue to evolve? As we continue to live in a world ruled by the clock, perhaps the greatest challenge we face is learning to live with time, to embrace its passage, without being enslaved by it. In the mid-19th century, Ireland was hit by one of the most devastating famines in modern history, the Great Irish Potato Famine, which began in 1845 and lasted for several years. This tragedy, often called the Potato Famine, had far-reaching consequences, not just for Ireland, but for the entire British Empire, and for the millions of Irish people who were forced to flee their homeland in search of survival. Before the famine struck, Ireland was an agrarian society with a largely rural population. Without their primary source of food, many Irish families faced starvation. The famine was made even worse by the fact that Ireland was under British rule at the time, and the response from the British government was insufficient. The Irish population, which had been over 8 million before the famine, began to shrink rapidly due to both death and immigration. The poorest families, who were the most dependent on potatoes for survival, found themselves without food, shelter, or resources. Cities like Dublin and Cork saw a rise in poverty and disease as people flocked to the cities in search of food and shelter. However, the city's resources were already stretched thin, and the influx of famine refugees created a situation where both rural and urban areas were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of suffering. Entire villages were abandoned, and in some cases, entire communities were wiped out. Many people who had once lived off the land were left landless, and tenant farmers found it increasingly difficult to survive without their homes or their crops. Most traveled in steerage, the cheapest and most uncomfortable part of the ship. The conditions on the ships were appalling, with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and outbreaks of disease. They became integral to the growth of American cities, working on the railroads, in factories, and in the construction of canals and buildings. Over time, the Irish formed tight-knit communities, built churches, and began to exert political influence in cities like New York and Boston. Many people died during the journey, and those who survived arrived in American ports like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia in desperate condition. The changes were felt not just by those who remained in Ireland, but by the millions who had been forced to leave their homeland. And the establishment of the Irish Free State in the early 20th century. The famine is seen by many as a failure of British governance, one that left deep scars in the relationship between Ireland and Britain. The famine, along with its aftermath, became a defining moment in Irish history, one that would influence generations of Irish people and shape their relationships with both the British and the world. Many of them had little education or marketable skills, and they were often relegated to the most menial and dangerous jobs. The Irish were seen as undesirable immigrants by many Americans, who feared the growing number of poor and unskilled laborers arriving from Ireland. The tragedy of the famine is not just a story of suffering and survival, it is also a story of resilience and transformation, one that reshaped both the people of Ireland and the countries they sought refuge in. The experience of the famine and the subsequent migration shaped the Irish identity in America. The legacy of the Great Irish Potato Famine continues to be an important part of the Irish-American experience, with many Irish Americans tracing their roots back to the generations who fled their homeland during this period of crisis. In the wake of the disaster, there was a growing sense of nationalism and resentment toward British rule. The Anglo-Irish relations, which had always been strained, were now irreparably damaged. Many Irish began to demand home rule, the ability for Ireland to govern itself, as well as social reform to address the widespread poverty and inequality in the country. The people who were left behind were often forced to sell their land to survive, and the Irish countryside became dotted with empty, abandoned cottages. It's estimated that more than 1 million people died from starvation and related diseases, such as typhus and dysentery, in the years that followed. Another 1 million immigrated, most of them to America, in what would become one of the largest waves of migration in modern history. While some aid was sent to Ireland, it was not enough to counteract the widespread destruction caused by the blight. Additionally, policies like land taxes and exporting food from Ireland to Britain during the famine years exacerbated the suffering, creating a deep sense of injustice among the Irish people. Faced with a bleak future in Ireland, many Irish families sought to escape the devastation by crossing the Atlantic. The journey to America, though dangerous and difficult, offered a potential escape from hunger and death. The country's economy relied heavily on agriculture, and the potato, a crop that was easy to grow and nutritionally rich, had become the staple food for most Irish families. Potatoes were not only cheap to produce but also provided a vital source of calories and nutrients to sustain large families, particularly in the poorest rural areas. For many, the potato was not just a source of food but the backbone of their entire diet, making up a substantial portion of their daily intake. However, the reliance on a single crop would prove to be a critical vulnerability. In 1845, a devastating disease known as potato blight struck Ireland's potato crop. This fungus spread quickly across the fields, causing the potatoes to rot in the ground and rendering the harvest unusable. What began as a mild concern in 1845 turned into an overwhelming catastrophe in 18... when the blight struck again, devastating nearly all the potato crops in Ireland. The failure of the potato crop had an immediate and severe impact on the Irish population. The impact of the famine, starvation and disease. As the famine worsened, starvation became rampant. Rural Ireland bore the brunt of the famine. The urban centers were also affected, though not to the same extent. In the years that followed the famine, Ireland's social and economic landscape was dramatically changed. The migration, the Irish diaspora, the mass migration of Irish people to America, was one of the most significant outcomes of the famine. The majority of Irish immigrants who left during the famine years were poor and working-class individuals with few resources or connections in America. Upon arriving in America, the Irish immigrants faced discrimination and poverty. Despite these challenges, the Irish immigrants gradually found their place in American society. The migration of the Irish during the famine years was not only a survival story, but also one of transformation. The political and social aftermath of the famine. The Irish famine also had a political and social impact on Ireland itself. The memory of the famine fueled a desire for Irish independence, which would culminate in the later Irish War of Independence. The British government's response to the famine is often criticized for its inadequate relief efforts and the policies that led to the suffering of the Irish people. As the Great Irish Potato Famine marked a turning point in Irish history, its effects were felt long after the last of the famine victims had died or fled to foreign lands. The Irish Potato Famine, though a time of overwhelming devastation, also sparked significant changes in Irish society. both in Ireland and in the countries that became home to many of the emigrants. For generations to come, the famine would define not only the Irish national identity, but also its relationships with the British Empire, America, and other parts of the world. The Irish immigrants, though separated by the ocean, carried the memory of their homeland and the struggle for survival that marked their migration. Ireland, after the famine, recovery and resistance landlords, many of whom were absentee owners, had left their tenants with little to no support, and the British response to the famine had been slow and inadequate. The Irish began to demand self-rule from Britain, and the events of the famine further entrenched the belief that Irish sovereignty was crucial for their survival. The Irish nationalism movement gained traction in the wake of the famine, leading to increased agitation for Irish independence and land reform. The influx of Irish immigrants during and after the famine shaped the cultural fabric of many cities, particularly in the United States. They were often seen as foreigners, paupers, and laborers who took jobs away from native-born Americans. Thousands of Irish laborers worked on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and other rail networks, often under dangerous conditions. This became a crucial entry point for Irish immigrants into American society and provided them with a foothold in the workforce. The Irish were frequently depicted as dirty, uneducated, and unskilled stereotypes that marginalized them in American society. The stories of their ancestors' suffering and survival were passed down through generations, and the idea of the famine became a point of pride and resilience for the Irish community, both in Ireland and in the diaspora. Yet, the Irish quickly became an integral part of American life, particularly in urban centers, where they found work in factories, construction, and domestic service. They supported Irish independence movements, and through their political and financial power, played a significant role in Ireland's push for home rule and eventual independence from Britain. Many Irish Americans were fiercely loyal to Ireland, sending remittances to their families, supporting charitable causes, and pushing for the Irish independence movement. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of a new one, both for Ireland and for the Irish diaspora. The memory of the famine, however painful, continues to shape the identity of the Irish people. For many, the Great Famine is a symbol of the struggles that shaped their ancestors' lives. As the descendants of those who lived through the famine continue to reflect on this dark chapter of their history, they honor the legacy of their ancestors, whose strength in the face of adversity helped shape the world they live in today, and a reminder of the strength and resilience that allowed them to survive, adapt, and thrive in new lands. Over time, the Irish began to reclaim the narrative of the famine. It remains a deeply emotional event in Irish collective memory, and efforts to understand and acknowledge the suffering of the Irish people during those years have led to important cultural reflection and healing. Rather than being seen as passive victims of British neglect, they were increasingly viewed as resilient survivors who had overcome the devastation and rebuilt their communities. The famine was not just a historical event for the Irish. It was a symbol of the oppression and hardship that had been suffered for centuries, and it became the rallying cry for those who sought to reshape Ireland's future. Cities such as New York, Boston, and Chicago became home to large Irish communities. Brought with them their language, religion, and culture. The British government's policies during the famine were often seen as cruel and neglectful. At a time when food could have been imported or distributed to the Irish people, policies that prioritized the exportation of grain to Britain or other parts of the empire contributed to the crisis. In the years following the Great Famine, Ireland underwent significant social and economic upheaval. They formed churches, political organizations, and social clubs. In cities like New York, the Irish began to assert their political power, with figures like Alfred E. Smith and John F. Kennedy eventually rising to national prominence. The Irish had gone from being marginalized immigrants to becoming an important and influential part of the American political establishment. The death of over 1 million people and the emigration of another 1 million severely impacted the Irish population. This demographic shift was particularly felt in rural areas, where the feudal system of tenant farming, in which landowners rented out land to peasants in exchange for rent, began to crumble. Landlords in many cases increased rents or evicted tenants who could no longer pay, adding to the suffering of the already impoverished peasantry. The loss of such a large portion of the population left behind empty towns, abandoned farms, and a devastated economy. Many parts of Ireland's agricultural base, particularly in the west and south, were never fully restored, and the system of tenant farming that had supported the rural population was deeply shaken. The population of Ireland fell from approximately 8 million in 1841 to 6.5 million by 1851, and it would not recover to pre-famine levels until the late 20th century. The Irish also began to see the famine as a direct consequence of British policies. As a result, the memory of the famine became a central part of the growing sense of Irish nationalism. The Irish diaspora, a legacy of migration, the migration of the Irish to countries like America, Canada, Australia, and Britain had lasting consequences, both for the immigrants themselves and for the societies they joined. In the United States, the Irish were initially met with hostility and discrimination. The Irish also played a key role in building America's infrastructure, particularly the railroads. Over time, Irish immigrants became more integrated into American society. The Irish identity, resilience, and remembrance. While many Irish immigrants integrated into their new lives in foreign lands, the memory of the famine remained a central part of their collective identity. The Irish diaspora, though scattered across the globe, retained a deep connection to their homeland. The memory of the famine also shaped the Irish-American relationship with their homeland. The legacy of the famine, reflection, and healing today. The Great Potato Famine is seen not only as a tragedy, but also as a turning point in Irish history. In Ireland, the famine serves as a reminder of the importance of social justice and the dangers of colonial oppression. The famine also remains an important part of the Irish-American experience, and it is commemorated every year, particularly on Irish Heritage Days and memorial events. The story of the Great Irish Potato Famine is one of suffering, but it is also a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring spirit of the Irish people. The aftermath of the Great Irish Potato Famine left an indelible mark on Ireland and its people. Beyond the tragedy of death and displacement, the famine served as a catalyst for profound social, economic, and political change, not just for Ireland, but also for the broader global community. The famine reshaped the future of Irish nationalism, fueled large waves of migration, and altered the cultural landscape of immigrant communities, especially in America. Ireland's path to independence. From famine to revolution, the trauma of the famine, coupled with the failure of British relief efforts, contributed directly to the growing resentment toward British rule. It was seen not only as an injustice to the Irish people, but also as evidence that Ireland needed to control its own destiny. It crystallized a desire for political autonomy and pushed the Irish toward rebellion, culminating in the Easter Rising of 1916 and the eventual establishment of the Irish Republic. The sense of injustice created by the famine and its aftermath remained at the heart of Ireland as political struggles throughout the early 20th century. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the push for home rule gained momentum. While home rule, the idea of devolved Irish governance within the British Empire, was never fully realized in the years following the famine. It paved the way for the eventual independence of the Irish Free State in 1922. The largest wave of Irish emigrants went to America, but Irish people also settled in Canada, Australia. Despite facing discrimination and prejudice, they found employment in construction, railroads, and factories, eventually making significant contributions to the industrial development of the United States. The Irish also began to make their mark on American politics, with Irish-American politicians becoming powerful figures in local and national governments. And displacement. The legacy of the Great Irish Potato Famine continues to be an important part of Irish culture and identity. Memorials have been erected in Ireland and abroad, and the famine is often depicted in literature, art, and music. Every year, on Gorta Mór Day, there are national commemorations that reflect on the impact of the famine and the importance of remembering the lives lost during that period. The famine remains a symbol of resilience and survival, and it is commemorated every year in Ireland and by Irish communities around the world. The Irish people have survived the loss of their homeland, and they have thrived in new lands, carrying their culture and history with them. It tells us of the dangers of inequality, the importance of community, and the need to address social injustice before it spirals into catastrophe. It also speaks to the strength of the human spirit, the ability of people to endure hardship, and the hope that even in the darkest of times, survival and rebirth are possible. The journey of survival and migration, which began with the tragedy of the famine, has become one of the most significant aspects of the Irish experience. Irish immigrants brought with them their customs, language, music, and traditions, blending them with the cultures of their new homes. St. Patrick's Day, for instance, went from a religious celebration in Ireland to a national holiday in America. Celebrated by people of all backgrounds, the failure of the British government to adequately address the crisis is still seen as one of the greatest moral failures of the 19th century. And the Irish demand for autonomy that arose out of it continues to echo in the ongoing discussions of independence and self-determination. In modern Ireland, it is a reminder of how vulnerable societies can be when they rely too heavily on a single crop or resource, and how important it is to maintain diverse and sustainable agricultural practices. The famine also highlights the dangers of colonialism, negligence, and the mismanagement of resources by ruling powers. The influence of Irish culture in American literature, theater, and politics grew stronger over time, and Britain, where they built new lives and became key players in the development of their adopted countries. For many Irish people, the famine became a symbol of British neglect and oppression, a reminder that Ireland's fate was often determined by forces beyond its control. It fueled the fire of Irish nationalism, leading to movements that sought not only to address the immediate crisis, but also to reshape Ireland's political future. Irish Americans played an instrumental role in funding the cause for Irish independence, raising money for revolutionary groups in Ireland, and lobbying the U.S. government to take a stance against British rule. The legacy of the famine and the struggle for independence became a key part of the Irish American identity, passed down through generations and celebrated in parades, festivals, and historical memory. The events of the famine became a cornerstone in the Irish independence movement. As millions of Irish immigrants settled in the United States, they became vocal advocates for Irish. They formed political organizations and lobbied the American government to put pressure on Britain. The Irish American community played a critical role in funding and supporting Irish revolutionary groups, such as the Fenian Brotherhood, which sought to fight for Ireland's independence through armed rebellion. Back in Ireland, the memory of the famine served as a rallying point for Irish nationalists. The famine's impact on the rise of Irish nationalism cannot be overstated. The Irish diaspora and its lasting influence. For the millions of Irish who left during and after the famine, the migration to new lands offered both escape and opportunity. In America, the Irish quickly established themselves in urban centers, particularly in cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago. As the Irish community in America grew, it became a powerful force for Irish nationalism. The Irish diaspora also had a profound effect on the culture of the nations they adopted, memory and healing. Reflecting on the famine, while the immediate aftermath of the famine was marked by suffering, loss in Ireland, the famine is remembered not just as a historical event, but as a traumatic chapter in the nation's history. For many, the famine also serves as a reminder of the need for social justice. The famine's lasting impact. Lessons for the modern world. The Great Irish Potato Famine is not just a story of historical suffering, it is a story of human endurance and the power of migration. As the Irish have rebuilt their communities, not just in Ireland but around the world, the legacy of the famine lives on in the stories passed down through generations. The story of the Great Potato Famine is a reminder that the struggles of the past continue to shape our world today. The Wild West has often been romanticized as a land of opportunity, where pioneers, settlers, and adventurers could carve out a new life amidst rugged landscapes and untamed wilderness. But for many who made the perilous journey west, the reality was far more harsh, isolating, and lonely. The vast, open spaces of the American frontier were filled with opportunity. For the majority of settlers, life on the Great Plains or in the mountain passes was sparse, marked by long stretches of emptiness between neighbors, with often hundreds of miles separating homesteads. For most pioneers, the closest neighbors were often miles away, and daily life was shaped by the absence of community and support. Families often lived in solitary cabins, and even when there were neighbors nearby, the journey to visit them could take days. But they were also fraught with the challenges of surviving in one of the most isolated and untamed environments in the world. For settlers, loneliness was often the most difficult challenge to face. Without the company of extended family or neighbors, many individuals experience feelings of isolation and despair. The isolation could drive some to mental breakdowns or destructive behavior, while others found ways to cope through resilience and community. In the mid-1800s, the United States government, eager to expand westward, began promoting settlement in the uncharted territories of the West. For women, particularly, the isolation could be suffocating. Women were often responsible for the daily upkeep of the home, including cooking, cleaning, childcare, and animal care, with no social outlets or opportunities to interact with others. Many women felt incredibly isolated. Family bonds were essential to surviving the emotional and physical hardships of frontier life. In a world where neighbors were distant and towns were rare, the family became the central unit of support, care, and survival. Children were a vital part of frontier life, and many died from disease or injury before reaching adulthood. Death was a common part of life on the frontier, and it often struck when settlers were least prepared. The isolation and lack of support meant that families often had to deal with loss and solitude, making grief even harder to bear. For women who had to raise children far from other families, the lack of emotional support and social contact could lead to feelings of depression and hopelessness. These towns were small, with businesses and homes clustered around the railroad or a central square. Though isolated from the rest of the world, these settlements became places where settlers could share experiences, swap stories, and form lasting friendships. Social gatherings, such as barn raisings, church services, and community dances, became vital outlets for human connection. The bonds between family members were forged in the fire of hardship and adversity, and many settlers found strength in their families as they faced the challenges of frontier life. With more people came more government regulation, more law enforcement, and more social expectations. The isolation that had once defined the frontier was beginning to fade, replaced by a growing sense of civilization and order. For many, this shift was both welcome and bittersweet. While the towns brought greater stability and community, they also marked the end of the untamed freedom that had defined frontier life. The family was the cornerstone of the community, even when that community was spread thin across a vast, isolated landscape. The isolation, the hardships, and the constant struggle for survival were part of the experience of carving out a new life on the American frontier. However, it was also the resilience and strength of individuals and families that allowed people to endure these challenges. The search for community, for connection, and for a sense of purpose became the thread that connected the isolated, lonely lives of frontier settlers to the larger story of American expansion. Families, particularly large ones, worked together to plant crops, raise livestock, and tend to the household. The division of labor was often strict, with each member of the family having a role to play in ensuring the success of the homestead. The work was long and hard, but families were also a source of comfort during difficult times. The Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of free land to settlers, willing to farm it for 5 years, encouraged people from all walks of life to migrate to the Great Plains, the Rockies, and beyond. With no neighbors to visit and no local town to escape to, many settlers were forced to face long months of solitude. The threat of Native American attacks The risk of illness and the ever-present danger of the wilderness made settlers feel vulnerable. Without the support of a nearby community or the protection of a fortified settlement, many were left to face these dangers on their own. The isolation of frontier life was compounded by the fact that the closest community might be miles away, with no clear path to reach it. As the United States expanded westward, the frontier was still largely uninhabited, with few established towns or cities. It was not until later in the 19th century that towns began to spring up along major railroad routes, offering the first real chance for settlers to interact with one another and build a sense of community. In cases of illness, injury, or personal loss, families often had to cope in isolation, with no one to rely on but themselves. During the long winters, the days could stretch on endlessly with little human contact. The lack of communication and interaction with others could create a feeling of separation from the rest of the world. While physical labor and the dangers of the frontier were well documented, the emotional and psychological strain of living in such isolation was less understood. In many cases, settlers had no choice but to adapt to their circumstances, regardless of the toll it took on their mental health. But for many, this promise of land and a fresh start came with a heavy price, one that involved isolation, danger, and loneliness. The idea of isolation was central to the experience of those who settled the frontier. The land, while offering freedom, could also be brutal. The settlers, often without the luxury of modern tools or supplies, had to rely on their own wits and resourcefulness to build homes, raise crops, and feed their families. The work was often exhausting and unrelenting. The daily struggle of isolation living on the frontier was about survival first and foremost. The physical labor required to establish a homestead was staggering. Many families had to cut down trees, clear the land, dig wells, and build homes, all without the help of neighbors or towns. Log cabins, the most common type of home in the frontier, took weeks or months to construct, depending on the size of the family and their resources. These homes were often rudimentary, offering little comfort from the harsh winters or scorching summers. For many, the isolation of the frontier was not just a social experience, it was a physical and emotional trial. In addition to the overwhelming physical demands of life on the frontier, there were the psychological strains that came with isolation. The mental toll of the frontier. Coping with loneliness. The isolation of the frontier often had a profound psychological impact on settlers. This solitude could also lead to a sense of insecurity. While some settlers thrived in the solitude of the frontier, many found it overwhelming. The mental toll of this isolation often went unacknowledged at the time. The role of the family. The cornerstone of frontier life. One of the few sources of emotional support for settlers on the frontier was their family. For many settlers, the family was not just a source of emotional connection, it was also a workforce. However, the demanding nature of life on the frontier meant that families often experienced significant losses. Despite these hardships, families on the frontier were often incredibly resilient. The longing for community. The search for connection for many settlers. The longing for community was one of the defining aspects of life on the frontier. When towns did form, they often became centers of trade, culture, and social interaction. However, the formation of these towns also meant that the frontier was becoming more settled and less wild. The loneliness of the frontier was a defining characteristic of life for many settlers in the Wild West. As the frontier settled and towns began to emerge, the isolation that once defined the Wild West began to evolve. The spirit of self-reliance and the harsh realities of life on the frontier were still present, but they became intertwined with the development of communities, infrastructure, and a more regulated society. While this shift brought some relief from the overwhelming loneliness of earlier years, it also introduced new challenges and complexities for those who had chosen the frontier as their home. The role of the railroad, linking the frontier. One of the most significant changes that helped to reduce isolation was the expansion of the railroad. The arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 19th century transformed the landscape of the American West. Thousands of settlers, often without the support of families or community, sought to build homes on these parcels of land. Many of them faced not just the challenges of survival, but also the emotional toll of living far from civilization. With easier access to distant markets, towns grew and prospered, and new communities sprang up along the tracks. While the promise of land and freedom was appealing, the reality was that farming in the West was a grueling year-round effort. These towns, built near rivers, railroads, or agricultural hubs, provided settlers with the opportunity to come together for religious services, trade goods, and share news. The difficulty of travel and the sheer distance between towns meant that visiting others or participating in larger social events was still a rare luxury for many. They found solace in church gatherings, community events, and the rare opportunities for socializing. They organized social events, ran households, and cared for children while also managing the daily hardships of life on the frontier. Their stories, though often overlooked in the larger narrative of the Wild West, are a testament to the resilience of those who shaped the future of the American frontier. While the men were often off working the land or engaging in trade, it was the women who maintained the social fabric of these isolated communities. The daily struggles to survive, the difficulty of communication, and the lack of social networks left many settlers vulnerable to emotional strain. The vast distances between homesteads created a sense of detachment from the rest of the world, but it was not until towns and cities began to emerge that many settlers truly began to feel connected to the larger world. Even then, the sense of being alone, both physically and emotionally, remained a constant theme of frontier life. Those who made the journey to the frontier often had to leave behind everything they knew, friends and familiar comforts. From the isolation of homesteaders and farmers to the struggles of women trying to build homes and communities, the emotional and psychological toll of living on the edge of civilization was profound. Yet, despite the overwhelming isolation, settlers found ways to adapt, survive, and ultimately create a sense of community in the face of daunting challenges. These moments, though infrequent, were vital to the mental and emotional well-being of women who often worked tirelessly without much recognition. The arrival of other women in newly established towns or settlements provided them with much-needed companionship, and social networks formed to help one another with chores, child-rearing, and emotional support in the harsh environment of the frontier. Even familial bonds could feel distant. Settlers often had to focus on survival, leaving little room for the emotional intimacy and community connections that characterize life in more settled areas. Communication often relied on long letters sent through the postal service, which could take weeks to arrive. The growth of these towns allowed for the creation of schools, churches, post offices, and even newspapers, all of which helped to bring settlers out of isolation and into the folds of a more structured society. While men worked in the fields, built homes, and traded, women were often responsible for the domestic tasks: cooking, cleaning, childcare, and sewing. The work was constant, and the physical isolation was compounded by a lack of social support. Without nearby family or friends, many women struggled with the psychological effects of loneliness and the feeling of being cut off from the world. The land, though rich in resources, was harsh and unforgiving. The work of clearing fields, planting crops, and raising animals often kept settlers in physical isolation for months on end, with few opportunities to interact with neighbors. As the railroad expanded westward, it displaced Native American tribes, disrupted existing ecosystems, and led to increased competition for resources such as land and water. The once vast, open land was now being divided by tracts and settlements, and with that division came the loss of freedom that many pioneers had come to cherish. The open frontier was gradually becoming a place governed by laws and regulations, rather than the untamed liberty that had attracted so many in the first place. Railroad towns became centers of trade, entertainment, and social gatherings, and they played a crucial role in creating more interconnected and less isolated pockets of civilization. It linked previously isolated towns and communities, making travel and trade faster and more efficient. For the first time, settlers could travel west in relative comfort. and goods could be shipped quickly between the coastlines and the interior. The railroad not only facilitated the movement of people and products, but also played a vital role in shaping the economy and social structure of the frontier. However, the arrival of the railroad also brought with it challenges: the Homestead Act and the rise of small towns. The Homestead Act of 1862, which offered 160 acres of land to anyone willing to cultivate it for 5 years, spurred migration to the Western Territories. As settlers staked their claims and started their farms, they found themselves isolated from the bustling life of the eastern United States and the larger cities. In these early days, small towns began to emerge as a response to the need for social connection and services. But even as these towns provided a sense of community, the loneliness of the frontier was never fully alleviated. Gender and isolation. Women on the frontier. The experience of isolation on the frontier was particularly challenging for women. Yet, women on the frontier often formed tight-knit communities, despite the isolation. In many ways, women played a central role in creating a sense of community on the frontier. For women who endured the loneliness and physical labor of the frontier, the journey was one of immense strength and perseverance. The psychological effects of isolation. Coping with the distance. The psychological toll of isolation on the frontier is an often underexplored aspect of pioneer life. For many, this isolation led to a deep sense of loneliness, even within their own families. The introduction of telegraphs, newspapers, and later railroads began to ease the isolation to some extent. The loneliness of the frontier was a defining aspect of the pioneer experience. As the frontier expanded and towns began to emerge, the sense of isolation that characterized the early years of settlement slowly began to shift. However, even as communities formed and infrastructure was built, the challenges of living on the frontier remained. The frontier continued to be a place where settlers had to deal with the complexities of survival, loneliness, and identity, and the psychological impact of these struggles endured for generations. These new settlements, though offering a semblance of society, were still subject to the insecurity and discomfort of life in a region where resources were scarce, laws were often unclear, and conflict was never far away. Frontier life. A changing landscape. With the creation of these towns came a new set of social dynamics. For some, reading the newspaper was one of the few ways they could engage with national and international news, providing a brief escape from the daily struggles of frontier life. Mail could take weeks to reach its destination, and in more remote areas, people could go months without receiving any news at all. For many, the mail became a beacon of hope and connection, no matter how long it took for it to arrive. In addition to mail, some settlers had access to telegraphs, especially those living along key trade routes or near towns with larger populations. Telegraphs helped expedite communication, though they were often costly and limited in scope. Churches became more than just places of worship. They were centers of community and support. Sunday services were often the only social gatherings in small towns, and for many, they provided not only spiritual guidance. These towns, though still isolated, became places where people could come together and share resources. As towns grew, they attracted a wider range of services and entertainment, such as schools, theaters, and town squares. These towns became central hubs for settlers to gather and trade. Although they were still separated by large expanses of wilderness, some settlers took to visiting these towns only when absolutely necessary, as the journey to them could take days or even weeks. The lack of formal law enforcement in many parts of the Wild West led to the creation of vigilante justice. Self-defense and personal responsibility were valued virtues on the frontier, and many settlers took pride in their ability to protect themselves and their property. Yet, with the growth of towns, the demand for order became more pressing. Law enforcement, though limited at first, began to take shape in more developed towns, and sheriffs, deputies, and marshals began to play a key role in maintaining law and order. As the West transformed into a more settled and connected region, the relationships and communities that emerged helped shape the future of America. The settlers who lived through the isolation of the frontier played an essential role in the development of the American West, and their legacy lives on in the towns, institutions, and stories that now define this iconic part of American history. The lawless years of the frontier gave way to more structured forms of justice, but the sense of danger and insecurity persisted for many settlers. In towns where lowmen were scarce, residents often took matters into their own hands, whether by organizing posses to chase down criminals or by holding town trials to settle disputes. But for others, towns became places of opportunity and interaction where businesses thrived and social ties were formed. The passage of the Homestead Act, the completion of the railroad, and the increasing presence of the U.S. military marked the end of the frontier era. The promise of open land began to dwindle as more settlers arrived, pushing indigenous populations off their lands and increasing competition for resources, whether through local markets, social gatherings, or simple neighborly assistance. These early communities provided settlers with a support network they had often lacked in the early years of settlement. The isolation that once defined a frontier experience began to fade, replaced by growing towns and cities connected by modern infrastructure. Yet, for those who had lived through the early years of settlement, the memory of isolation remained a reminder of the strength and resilience it took to build lives in the harshest conditions. But as more settlers arrived, the towns grew, eventually becoming cultural and economic centers. The building of schools, churches, and social clubs helped bring together people who were previously isolated from one another, allowing them to form a sense of shared identity and community spirit. However, this growth also led to new tensions and conflicts, as different groups, whether by ethnicity, religion, or ideology, but also the chance to see familiar faces and build bonds of friendship. Local governments were established, bringing a modicum of law and order to regions that had previously been wild and lawless. Religious leaders were often among the few figures of authority in these remote regions, and they played a significant role in providing not just religious services, but also emotional support to families facing overwhelming isolation. While the process of sending letters could still take weeks or even months, it became one of the primary ways settlers maintained connections with the outside world. It was a place where they could come together to share experiences, offer mutual support, and find a sense of connection. Church services and social events associated with the church, like bake sales, fairs, or potluck dinners, became important social outlets that helped families cope with the challenges of living on the frontier. Letters became the lifeline for many pioneers, serving as a link to their families back east, to far-off friends, or to potential buyers and suppliers. The arrival of the mail carrier was an eagerly awaited event, as it meant news, updates, and, in some cases, news from home. Yet, even in these more established areas, the sense of isolation and self-reliance remained pervasive. Those settlers could now interact with their neighbors and obtain supplies from local stores. The very nature of frontier life meant that people were still spread out across vast distances, and communication remained slow and difficult. Towns were often scattered, and roads were often little more than dusty trails, making travel time-consuming and dangerous. As settlers moved westward, many found themselves living in more structured communities, with access to stores, schools, and churches, yet they were still far removed from the larger world. Towns and small communities grew along the railroad lines and near mining camps or agricultural hubs. The role of the mail, connecting a dispersed world, one of the key developments that helped reduce the isolation of frontier life, was the establishment of the postal system. The mail also carried newspapers, which helped settlers stay informed about events in the wider world. Despite these advancements, the sense of isolation remained. The importance of religion, community, and solace for many settlers. Religion played a crucial role in coping with the loneliness of the frontier. In the early years of settlement, traveling preachers and missionaries would often visit isolated homesteads, bringing comfort and hope to families who had little other contact with the outside world. For women, especially, the church became an important source of solace. The role of settler communities, building connections. As more settlers moved west, the establishment of small towns and communities was a natural progression. Towns along the railroad routes or in mining regions were often the first to flourish. In the early days of settlement, most towns were small and centered around basic needs like water, food, and shelter. Conflict and the law of frontier justice. The isolation of the frontier often meant that settlers had to rely on themselves to resolve disputes and enforce order. The sense of isolation often made settlers feel responsible for the safety of their homes and families. Legacy of isolation. The end of the frontier as the 19th century drew to a close. The frontier began to close as well. By the turn of the century, the West had become more settled, and the towns and cities of the frontier began to blend into the fabric of modern America. The loneliness of the frontier may have been the defining characteristic of the early settler experience, but it was also a temporary condition. Surviving in the American Wild West was no easy feat. The frontier was a land of both immense beauty and untamed danger. Whether the settler, prospector, or cowboy was fighting the harsh desert sun, freezing nights, or wild animals, basic survival depended on the availability of three crucial resources: water, food, and fire. Without them, even the most rugged individuals would succumb to the brutality of the environment. In the arid regions, where rainfall was sparse and rivers were sometimes miles away, settlers and travelers faced immense challenges in securing fresh water. But they were often far apart, and not everyone had the privilege of living near one. The water table was often difficult to reach, and digging wells was a time-consuming and sometimes unsuccessful task. Ranchers and farmers competed for the rights to the few precious springs and rivers. Water was often more valuable than gold or land, as it was essential for survival. The early settlers often relied on the land to provide for their needs, but the terrain was not always forgiving. The soil in some areas was too dry or rocky to support crops, and the growing season was often too short to allow for large-scale farming. Wild game, like bison, deer, elk, and wild turkeys, was a rich source of meat. In many ways, hunting was essential for settlers in the West, especially in the early years. The open range was a vast and dangerous place for livestock, and cattle could easily be lost to predators or theft. These stores, however, were often expensive and poorly stocked. While items like flour, salt, and sugar were available, fresh produce was a rarity. However, these trade routes were often fraught with danger, and the journey for supplies could take weeks, especially for isolated settlers living far from the nearest town. Food shortages were a frequent occurrence in these early years, and the inability to feed oneself was a constant worry on the frontier. Many settlers were forced to make do with preserved foods, such as dried meats, jerky, and canned goods that could withstand the journey westward. The bison, for example, was crucial to the lives of both settlers and Native American tribes. The use of fire to clear land often contributed to the destruction of ecosystems and the loss of native plant species, but it was also essential for making land usable for agriculture. Fire was not just a tool for cooking and warmth, it was essential for protection and signal communication. The availability of these essential resources dictated the success or failure of settlements, and their scarcity often meant the difference between life and death. As settlers moved west, they had to learn to adapt to the land and its harsh realities. With these three resources being at the heart of their struggle, settlers used fire to cook food, heat homes, and protect themselves from the cold, especially during the harsh winter months. But fire was also critical for safety. The Wild West was home to a range of wild animals, including wolves, bears, and mountain lions. In some areas, hostile Native American tribes could pose a threat as well. A campfire or bonfire could act as both a warning signal and a deterrent to animals and people alike. Bison were used for food, clothing, and tools, with every part of the animal being utilized. This led to the development of local laws and water districts, with settlers sometimes resorting to legal battles or even violence to secure their share. However, crops were vulnerable to pests, droughts, and even diseases that could destroy an entire harvest. The Great Potato Famine had already shown the dire consequences of relying too heavily on one crop. Wood was sometimes hard to come by in areas where trees were scarce, and settlers had to rely on dry brush, grass, and cow dung to fuel their fires. For those living in sod houses, which lacked chimneys and proper ventilation, fire also represented a constant risk. Fires could easily spread in the dry, windy conditions of the West, threatening entire towns or homesteads. Even in more established towns, fire was a common and dangerous occurrence, with wooden buildings and dry conditions making fires an ever-present danger. Game was often hard to find, especially as more settlers moved west and began hunting large populations of animals. The overhunting of bison, in particular, led to the near extinction of the species by the end of the 19th century, a devastating blow to the people who relied on them for survival. This was not lost on settlers in the West, but even with diversification, food sources could be unreliable, and many lived with the constant fear that their crops would fail. For those who did manage to find water, the next challenge was to make sure it was clean enough to drink, as waterborne diseases were a constant threat. Sewage contamination and the proximity of livestock to water sources could easily make water sources unsafe. The journey through the desert, for example, was particularly perilous because water sources were often scarce, and a lack of water could lead to dehydration, heat stroke, and eventually death. The Wild West was a place of extremes, where the elements could be both a source of nourishment and devastation. The plains, mountains, and deserts were vast, and settlers often found themselves facing distances that could take days to traverse. The availability of these resources determined the fate of many who lived or traveled there. Their importance cannot be overstated, for in the wilderness, the lack of water, food, or fire could mean death. Water, the lifeblood of survival, perhaps the most precious resource in the Wild West, was water. Rivers such as the Colorado and Missouri were vital for the survival of settlers in the West. The scarcity of water became even more evident during the summer months. Many towns in the West were situated in regions with scorching temperatures, and by midsummer, the very soil seemed to bake under the sun. Settlers relied on water carried in casks or barrels to quench their thirst. As trade routes expanded, wagon trains often carried several weeks' worth of water, but this had to be rationed carefully, and if a water source was missed, or if a well ran dry, it could spell disaster for the entire party. In some parts of the West, water rights became a source of conflict. Food, the struggle to nourish the body. The second critical resource was food. For those on the frontier, the ability to grow or hunt food was a matter of life and death. Many settlers relied on the potato and corn as staple crops. For those who could hunt or raise livestock, food was more abundant. However, hunting posed its own set of challenges. Raising livestock like cattle or chickens could be a reliable source of food for those who had the means, but ranchers often faced challenges related to feed, water, and predators. In towns, settlers relied on trading posts and general stores for food. As communities grew, trade networks became more vital, and food could be imported from outside areas. Fire, the essential element of survival. The final crucial resource for settlers on the frontier was fire. The challenges of building a fire in the frontier were not insignificant. Fire also served as a method of land clearing. Settlers would sometimes burn the prairie grasses to clear land for farming, a practice that was both effective and dangerous. In the Wild West, water, food, and fire were not just necessities. As the first settlers and pioneers made their way into the wilderness of the Wild West, the realization that survival depended on the balance and availability of basic resources became abundantly clear. Their lives were often governed by these three essential elements: water, food, and fire. The role of water, food, and fire in daily life was a constant struggle. Settlers who learned to efficiently manage these resources were far more likely to succeed. Early pioneers often had to rely on natural rivers, springs, or wells to meet their daily needs. The depth of the water table varied, and in some areas, the wells produced little or no water. Where water was found, it was not always clean. Waterworks were developed in towns, near rivers or lakes, to support the growing populations and businesses. But for the more isolated settlers, water remained the lifeblood of their existence, and any interruption in access could lead to devastating consequences. Settlers needed to boil water or filter it, especially in areas where disease spread through contaminated water supplies. In towns, waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery were common, exacerbated by the lack of proper sanitation and the tendency to dispose of waste in or near water sources. Farming and livestock raising were the primary means of obtaining food. For those living in the Great Plains, the land was often barren and dry. General stores offered goods such as flour, sugar, salt, and preserved meats, but these supplies were costly. The ability to hunt and fish was a skill that could mean the difference between survival and starvation, particularly in winter, when the scarcity of food was most keenly felt. As railroads expanded and trade routes opened up, settlers had more access to outside food sources, though they often had to rely on canned goods and preserved foods, which did not always provide the variety or nutrition needed for long-term health. Cattle, sheep, and horses required vast amounts of grass and water to survive, and ranchers often moved their herds between grazing lands to avoid overgrazing and to ensure sufficient feed. For many, fire was also a source of safety, as it could be used to ward off wild animals or even hostile encounters with other settlers or Native Americans. It was central to community life in small towns. The town square bonfire or social gatherings around a campfire were vital for creating a sense of community. People gathered around the fire to share stories, exchange news, and bond over shared experiences. Without them, the promise of a new life in the American West would have been nothing but a mirage. The settlers' ability to manage these resources, often with little support and great ingenuity, determined whether they survived or perished in the unforgiving landscape. Fire also had spiritual significance, representing a beacon of light in a hostile and dark world. The establishment of barbed wire fencing in the late 1800s helped ranchers to manage their livestock and protect grazing lands. However, as towns grew and trees were cleared for farming, firewood became a scarce commodity, especially in areas with long, cold winters. Settlers had to be resourceful in making sure they had enough fuel for their stoves and fireplaces. The dry, wind-swept plains and mountain forests were highly susceptible to wildfires, and settlers often found themselves battling blazes that could destroy homes, crops, and livestock. The threat of fire was a constant fear on the frontier, and many families went to great lengths to fireproof their homes by digging moats, clearing dry brush, and keeping an emergency supply of water on hand. In many cases, dried manure or dried grasses were used as alternative sources of heat. But the open range system where cattle roamed freely was becoming increasingly impractical. As more settlers arrived, the growing conflict over land rights and grazing territories led to frequent tensions and disputes. Farmers had to learn how to grow crops that were suited to the tough climate. Hunting was often a necessity for supplementing food supplies, especially in more remote regions where farming was not an option. In areas like the Rocky Mountains or the Great Plains, hunters would spend days or even weeks traveling across vast distances to find game. However, hunting posed its own challenges. The overhunting of bison, especially in the late 19th century, nearly led to the extinction of the species, affecting the survival of both settlers and indigenous populations. In regions like the Great Basin, irrigation was essential to growing crops such as corn, wheat, and barley. But even with irrigation, droughts remained a significant threat to the stability of farm life. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, though decades later, was a stark reminder of the volatility of farming in the West. However, the land could be unforgiving. In the early years were often marked by failed crops, poor soil conditions, and unpredictable weather. In areas where these water sources were scarce or unreliable, the consequences could be deadly. However, Those who could not adapt faced the harsh realities of frontier life, where survival was never guaranteed. Each had its own challenges, and when one of these resources became scarce, it created dire consequences for the settlers and adventurers relying on them. As settlers turned the land into productive farms, they realized the importance of diverting water from nearby rivers to nourish their crops. Irrigation ditches were dug, and by the late 19th century, large-scale irrigation projects began to transform parts of the West into fertile agricultural regions. However, water rights became a major issue. As populations grew and the demand for water increased, settlers competed fiercely for water access, leading to the development of complex water loss systems. And often, tensions between farmers, ranchers, and native tribes over access to precious water sources. As settlers began to establish towns and farming communities, they began to understand the delicate balance required to sustain life in the West. Water, the lifeline for towns and farms. Water remained one of the most precious resources for settlers in the West. Many settlers dug wells near their homes, but this process was not always successful. The introduction of irrigation methods revolutionized agriculture in the West. Despite these challenges, water continued to define the success of frontier towns. Food. From farming to foraging, the quest for food was equally as critical. For early settlers, their ability to produce food was tied directly to their success on the frontier. The settlers who thrived were those who could adapt to the land's challenges. For ranchers, the difficulty of feeding livestock was also ever present. Wild game, such as bison, deer, and elk, also played an important role in the diet of many frontier settlers. For settlers who found themselves struggling to produce their own food, trade with nearby towns became essential. In the more remote regions, settlers learned to forage for wild plants and berries, and many became adept at hunting, fishing, and preserving whatever food they could find. Fire, the constant companion. The third and final essential for survival was fire. Fire was indispensable for cooking, warmth, and protection against the harsh elements. In the early days of settlement, firewood was abundant, and settlers would often gather it from the surrounding forests. The role of fire extended beyond practical survival. However, fire was also an ever-present danger. The essentials of water, food, and fire were at the very core of life on the frontier. As settlers continued to forge lives in the harsh conditions of the Wild West, managing water, food, and fire became the defining elements of their survival. These resources were often scarce, and their availability determined whether a family would thrive or be forced to leave the frontier. Over time, the knowledge of how to secure, preserve, and make the best use of these essentials became the foundation of frontier culture, shaping not just day-to-day life, but the very identity of the American West. Rivers, lakes, and underground water sources became the focal points of conflicts between settlers, ranchers, and the Native American tribes who had lived in the region for centuries. The idea of owning water or controlling access to it became an essential part of frontier life. The final frontier. Water wars and settlement conflicts. However, the natural water sources were often not sufficient to meet the needs of everyone. This led to competition for water, and disputes over water rights sometimes resulted in violent confrontations. In areas with long winters or scorching summers, food preservation methods were vital for survival. Many pioneers relied on drying and salting meats, especially jerky, as a way to preserve food for the lean months. Canning became another method of preservation, though it was more common in towns and settlements, where supplies and equipment were easier to come by. The railroad and its infrastructure played a significant role in the development of water systems that could support larger settlements. For example, canned fruits, vegetables, and meat products were in high demand in towns and mining camps. The fire brought people together, offering a place to exchange ideas, gossip, and news from other parts of the country. For settlers, the social importance of fire cannot be overstated. It was a beacon that offered warmth during the harsh winters and protection from the dangers of the wilderness. It was an emotional anchor, especially for families far from their homes. connecting them to the comforting routines of social life they left behind. In remote areas, settler families might trade homemade items such as blankets, clothing, and handcrafted tools for food or medicine. Wildfires were a major danger to settlers. Winter fires, made from wood, cow dung, or even sagebrush, kept settlers warm, while water was rationed and hunting became an essential part of survival. The railroads had connected the once isolated regions of the West, and settlers began to rely more heavily on trade and outside supplies. Yet, the essentials of survival, water, food, and fire remained at the core of life in the American West. The settlers' ability to adapt and manage these resources made them pioneers in every sense of the word. Firewood was gathered during the warmer months, and every item of clothing was mended and reused to maximize its longevity. The combination of dry weather, high winds, and the abundance of flammable material like dry grasses, timber, and old barns made the frontier particularly vulnerable to uncontrolled fires. Settlers had to be constantly vigilant, ensuring that their campfires and home fires were properly extinguished before nightfall. In towns, fire outbreaks were often devastating, especially in the early years, when buildings were made of wood and were densely packed together. This system of bartering ensured that settlers could acquire goods they couldn't grow or raise on their own. In some cases, settlers resorted to drastic measures, such as fire breaks, to prevent the spread of flames. These fire breaks involved creating a wide, cleared path devoid of vegetation, which could help to slow down or stop the spread of the fire. In some instances, entire communities had to evacuate, leaving behind their homes and all their possessions. The summer droughts left crops dry, and the winter snowstorms trapped settlers in their homes for days at a time. In the desert regions, the lack of rainfall and the sweltering heat posed a constant risk to those trying to live off the land. But it also kept frontier life, a system of limited resources and unpredictable availability. This was especially true in the earlier days of settlement, when railroads and roadways were either non-existent or poorly maintained. Blizzards, dust storms, and heat waves were common in many parts of the West, making life even more difficult for those already living in challenging circumstances. These towns, though still remote and isolated, often had small general stores that traded food, tools, and other essential goods. In return, settlers would bring their harvests and livestock, offering goods to exchange for things they could not produce themselves. Yet the struggle to maintain adequate water for agriculture, livestock, and human consumption remained an ongoing challenge throughout the frontier period. The notion that water, like land, could be owned and controlled by individuals was a foreign concept to many. Native tribes who had historically viewed water as a shared resource. As the population of the West grew, and more settlers staked their claims to land, the question of water rights became increasingly contentious. Early settlers, who often spent days or weeks without seeing another person, would gather around the campfire to share meals, tell stories, and connect with one another. The flickering flames of the fire were more than just a source of warmth. In light, they were a social bond that connected settlers across vast distances and helped them endure the loneliness and isolation of frontier life. In many cases, settler communities relied on irrigation systems to grow crops in the arid lands of the West. One of the most famous examples of water conflicts is the water wars in the Colorado River Basin. The tensions in this region escalated as settlers sought to control water for irrigation and livestock, and Native American communities fought to maintain access to their water sources. These conflicts shaped not only the West's development, but also laid the groundwork for the complex legal systems of water rights that exist today. By the end of the 19th century, towns and cities in the West began to develop complex water distribution systems and reservoirs, many of which were created with the help of the railroads and expanding technology. Food, preservation, and trade, a lifeline to remote settlers, with fresh food being difficult to preserve in the West's extreme climates. Settlers had to find creative ways to store and maintain food. For farmers and ranchers, preserving food wasn't just about sustaining their families. It was also a means of ensuring that they had products to sell. However, access to the basic tools of trade was limited. Fire, as a symbol of community and survival, fire remained an integral part of frontier life, not only for practical survival, but also as a symbol of community. In towns, the town square often had a central bonfire or public hearth where the community could gather to share news or conduct meetings. Despite its social benefits, fire also remained a constant threat. When wildfires did occur, they could destroy entire towns in a matter of hours, surviving the unforgiving elements, while water, food, and fire were the primary elements for survival. Settlers also had to contend with the harsh weather conditions that could drastically affect the availability of these resources. In the Great Plains, settlers often faced extreme temperatures, with scorching summers that could bake the land and bitterly cold winters that froze everything in sight. Yet, despite these challenges, settlers were resourceful and learned to adapt. By the end of the 19th century, life on the frontier had changed. The American frontier, especially in the West, was a land defined by its unpredictability. While settlers were prepared for the dangers of wild animals, scarce resources, and rough terrain, the weather posed a threat that was just as relentless and far less predictable. Some regions experienced long, dry summers with extreme temperatures, while others saw sudden floods or snowstorms that could isolate settlements for days. As settlers moved further west, they encountered a range of climates that shaped the way they lived, farmed, and even built their homes. As settlers ventured westward, they often underestimated the severity of winter weather in these high-altitude regions. For homesteaders and miners who lived in the Rockies, snowstorms were a constant challenge, and the isolation caused by these storms could lead to devastating consequences. Wagon trains, which made up a significant portion of westward migration, often found themselves stalled by deep snow or buried under the weight of an avalanche. It wasn't uncommon for travelers to be forced to wait out the storms, sometimes for weeks, in order to ensure their safety. The unpredictable weather in the West was not just an inconvenience, it could mean difference between survival and disaster. The region, which stretches across the central United States from Texas to Kansas, is notorious for its violent and unpredictable weather patterns, with tornadoes being one of the most terrifying and destructive forces to face the settlers there. The spring thaw often led to flooded fields, destroying delicate crops and further compounding the challenges of living in such an unpredictable environment. Families and towns became prepared for the worst, creating storm shelters or seeking refuge in cellars. When storms threatened, the fear of a tornado constantly looming over their heads was a defining aspect of life on the plains. Many settlers kept tornado survival kits, extra food, water, and blankets ready in case of disaster. For settlers who lived far from the safety of towns, this meant seclusion, limited access to supplies, and an increased risk of starvation and hypothermia. However, the risk of violent weather, especially tornadoes, was always present, and for many settlers, the occasional destructive storm was a harsh reminder of nature's power over human settlement. Houses built in these areas were often constructed as log cabins with minimal insulation, and many were heated by small wood-burning stoves. When floods occurred, they wiped out crops, fields, and homes, and often resulted in loss of life. Snowstorms in the Rockies, tornadoes on the Great Plains, and floods along rivers were forces that could destroy lives, communities, and entire families. But despite these challenges, settlers adapted, building homes, fortifying their communities, and learning the hard lessons of survival in a land shaped by nature's powerful and erratic behavior. Settlers learned to adapt by keeping emergency supplies and by building homes designed to withstand. However, the uncertainty of the weather made it difficult to prepare for such catastrophes. In many areas, especially those near rivers or in low-lying regions, floods were an ever-present threat. Spring floods, caused by melting snow or heavy rains, could inundate entire settlements, wiping out crops, livestock, and homes. In regions like the desert Southwest, heavy rains could trigger flash floods in otherwise dry riverbeds or canyons. These floods were difficult to predict and often caught people off guard. Flash floods could travel at incredible speeds, sweeping away everything in their path, homes, livestock, and even people. For settlers in these areas, the ability to read the signs of an incoming storm was critical to survival. In the Missouri River Valley, for example, spring rains often cause the river to swell and overflow its banks, leading to widespread flooding. This collision creates the perfect conditions for violent thunderstorms that can spawn tornadoes. These storms are intense, capable of destroying entire towns in minutes. Some built levees and dikes to prevent floodwaters from entering their land. But these measures were often insufficient. In particularly bad years, floods could lead to the destruction of entire communities. The twisters can develop quickly, leaving little time for preparation, and their winds can exceed speeds of 200 miles per hour, tearing apart everything in their path. While these stoves were essential for warmth, they often struggled to maintain heat during the most extreme storms, from blinding snowstorms in the Rocky Mountains to tornadoes in the Great Plains. The settlers had to learn to survive in a place where the elements were often their greatest adversaries. Many towns and homesteads were built without the knowledge or technology needed to protect themselves. Wooden homes, which were the most common type of construction on the Great Plains, offered little protection against the force of a tornado. Homes were often flattened in an instant, leaving families with nothing but debris and destruction. The landscape of the Wild West was diverse, ranging from arid deserts to towering mountain ranges, and its weather was just as varied. Snowstorms in the Rocky Mountains. The bitter cold among the most feared weather patterns in the American frontier were the snowstorms that frequently struck the Rocky Mountains. The winters in the Rockies were particularly harsh. Blizzards would roll in with little warning, dumping heavy snow over the land, often making travel impossible for days or even weeks. Snowstorms in the Rockies often led to avalanches, which were a particular hazard for those traveling in mountain passes or across snow-covered trails. Snow also had a profound impact on agriculture. Early settlers in the Rockies depended on farming to survive, but cold snaps could damage crops or freeze livestock. Tornadoes on the Great Plains, a terrifying force of nature. While snowstorms in the Rockies were devastating, the settlers of the Great Plains faced their own set of dangers in the form of tornadoes. Tornadoes are often associated with the vast flatness of the Great Plains, which allows warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico to collide with cold, dry air from the Rocky Mountains. In the mid-1800s, tornado forecasting was still in its infancy, so settlers had little warning when a tornado was approaching. The devastating power of these tornadoes meant that many settlers became accustomed to a constant state of anxiety. Despite the threat of tornadoes, the Great Plains became one of the most populated regions of the West, due in part to the fertile soil and vast open spaces for farming. Floods, the overwhelming force of water. In addition to snowstorms and tornadoes, settlers across the West also had to contend with the dangers posed by flooding. Towns and farms situated along rivers were at constant risk, and settlers had to build their homes and barns on higher ground to reduce the impact of seasonal flooding. Flash floods, caused by sudden rainstorms, were particularly dangerous. Though dams and reservoirs were later built to control flooding, early settlers had little protection from this deadly force of nature. The unpredictability of weather in the American West was not just an inconvenience. It was a constant threat to the settlers' survival. As settlers adapted to the harsh climates of the American West, they found themselves not only combating the physical effects of unpredictable weather, but also dealing with the emotional and psychological toll it took on their lives. The knowledge that weather could alter the course of their entire lives, destroying crops, damaging homes, or even claiming lives became ingrained in their way of life. For many, the uncertainty of the weather made the West a land of both opportunity and isolation, where the serious issue towns could become completely cut off for weeks at a time, as snowdrifts and frozen rivers made travel impossible. During these periods, families had to rely on stockpiled salted meats, dried vegetables, and whatever else could be preserved from the previous growing season. The long nights, harsh cold, and unpredictable storms were constant reminders that in the frontier, Survival often depended on a combination of both mental toughness and practical skill. For those who had underground cellars or access to canned goods, survival was somewhat easier. But those who were less prepared could quickly run out of food. The dust storms that ravaged the region were equally unpredictable and equally dangerous. Known as black blizzards, these dust storms were so intense that they could engulf entire towns, reducing visibility to near zero. These storms were created when strong winds lifted loose soil from the dry earth, creating a suffocating cloud of dust and debris. An unavoidable hardship where a single storm or extreme weather event could shift the balance between life and death. Blizzards in the Rockies. A winter of isolation. Settlers who lived near rivers and wetlands had to be constantly vigilant about the possibility of rising waters. Entire homes, barns, and fields could be washed away in a matter of hours. And once the water had receded, settlers were left with muddy debris, destroyed crops, and livestock lost to the water. It wasn't just the immediate loss that was devastating. Floods also made the rebuilding process slow and labor-intensive. Farmers had to replant crops, rebuild homes, and restore their livelihoods, all of which took time and significant resources. And as the West became more settled, the technology and knowledge developed to manage these elements improved. However, the weather remained one of the greatest challenges of frontier life, one that no amount of preparation or resourcefulness could completely overcome. In the Missouri River Basin, for example, spring rains would often swell the rivers, causing them to overflow their banks and flood nearby towns and farmland. Settlers who had already faced the long hours of work to build homes and establish farms were forced to start from scratch after each flood. Snowstorms in the Rockies, dust storms in the plains, and floods in the river valleys shaped the lives and destinies of those who ventured west. Settlers had to contend with forces beyond their control, and often these forces were the most dangerous and unpredictable of all. The constant possibility of losing everything created an atmosphere of uncertainty, and for some, it became too much to bear. Many settlers who had endured the hardships of droughts, tornadoes, and harsh winters found that they could not withstand the unrelenting force of the floods, which seemed to hit with increasing regularity. In California, settlers living near rivers like the Sacramento River faced similar risks during the rainy season. Years of over-farming and plowing contributed to the frequent dust storms as the soil became loose and prone to erosion. The constant battle to protect crops, homes, and livestock from the storms left many families feeling disillusioned and defeated. For many, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s was the culmination of years of suffering caused by droughts, unpredictable weather, and a fragile relationship between settlers and the land they were attempting to tame. During a dust storm, settlers were forced to seek shelter, often in their homes or dugouts, where they would close off windows and doors to avoid being engulfed in a choking cloud of dust. These storms could last for hours or even days, and they would leave everything covered in a fine layer of dirt, from furniture to food. Winter weather in the Rocky Mountains was notorious for its severity. Crops were often destroyed by the storms, and many farms faced poor yields because of the lack of moisture and the erosion of soil. The dust clouds would also clog up airways, leading to respiratory issues for both humans and animals. Some settlers, who found themselves trapped by the dust storms, became sick and weakened from the lack of clean air and constant exposure to the dust. While many settlers had experience with cold climates, the mountain winters brought an extra layer of danger. Blizzards, powerful snowstorms, with fierce winds and freezing temperatures, would sometimes strike without warning, trapping entire families and wagon trains in their homes or on the open trail. The effort to stay warm, especially in homes with poorly constructed fireplaces, could drain the energy of even the hardiest settlers. But beyond the physical toll, these blizzards carried a psychological weight. The constant isolation and long stretches of snowbound days caused deep feelings of despair for many. Settlers would sometimes go days without seeing another person, leading to a kind of social withdrawal. These snowstorms were so intense that visibility could drop to zero, and roads could become completely impassable. For the early settlers in mountain regions, the winter months were the most dangerous. Blizzards could also take a physical toll, making everyday tasks, like chopping wood or caring for livestock, nearly impossible. In many ways, the mountain winters served as both a test of survival and a test of mental resilience. Dust storms and the challenge of the plains on the Great Plains. The opposite extreme posed its own threat to settlers. Settlers, particularly those farming in the Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas areas, learned quickly that the land's soil was fragile. The dust storms of the plains had significant long-term effects on the settlers' ability to grow crops. In addition to the physical effects, the dust storms also took a toll on the mental well-being of the settlers. Floods, water's ferocity, and the risk of deluge, while snowstorms and tornadoes struck with sudden and intense violence. Floods were often just as dangerous, though they had a gradual and persistent impact. Floods were especially devastating because they struck with little warning and often left families with nothing. The psychological toll of dealing with floods was equally damaging. The weather of the Wild West was not just a backdrop to the drama or frontier. Life, it was an active participant in the struggle for survival. Despite the dangers, settlers and pioneers persevered. Their ability to adapt to the weather's extremes was key to their survival. As settlers adapted to the harsh climates of the American West, they found themselves not only combating the physical effects of unpredictable weather, but also dealing with the emotional and psychological toll it took on their lives. The knowledge that weather could alter the course of their entire lives, destroying crops, damaging homes, or even claiming lives, became ingrained in their way of life. For many, the uncertainty of the weather made the West a land of both opportunity and unavoidable hardship, where a single storm or extreme weather event could shift the balance between life and death. Blizzards in the Rockies, a winter of isolation. The long nights, harsh cold, and unpredictable storms were constant reminders that in the frontier, survival often depended on a combination of both mental toughness and practical skill. Winter weather in the Rocky Mountains was notorious for its severity. While many settlers had experience with cold climates, the mountain winters brought an extra layer of danger. The dust storms that ravaged the region were equally unpredictable and equally dangerous. Years of over-farming and plowing contributed to the frequent dust storms. As the soil became loose and prone to erosion, crops were often destroyed by the storms, and many farms faced poor yields because of the lack of moisture and the erosion of soil. The dust clouds would also clog up airways, leading to respiratory issues for both humans and animals. Settlers who lived near rivers and wetlands had to be constantly vigilant about the possibility of rising waters. Entire homes, barns, and fields could be washed away in a matter of hours, and once the water had receded, settlers were left with muddy debris, destroyed crops, and livestock lost to the water. It was indeed just the immediate loss that was devastating. Floods also made the rebuilding process slow and laborious. Farmers had to replant crops, rebuild homes, and restore their livelihoods, all of which took time and significant resources. And as the West became more settled, the technology and knowledge developed to manage these elements improved. However, the weather remained one of the greatest challenges of frontier life. One amount of preparation or resourcefulness could completely overcome. In the Missouri River Basin, for example, spring rains would often swell the rivers, causing them to overflow their banks and flood nearby towns and farmland. In California, settlers living near rivers like the Sacramento River face similar risks during the rainy season. Snowstorms in the Rockies, dust storms in the plains, and floods in the river valleys shaped the lives and destinies of those who ventured west. Settlers had to contend with forces beyond their control, and often these forces were the most dangerous and unpredictable of all. Some settlers, who found themselves trapped by the dust storms, became sick and weakened from the lack of clean air and constant exposure to the dust. During a dust storm, settlers were forced to seek shelter, often in their homes or dugouts, where they would close off windows. Settlers who had already faced the long hours of work to build homes and establish Farms were forced to start from scratch after each flood. The constant possibility of losing everything created an atmosphere of uncertainty. And for some, it became too much to bear. Many settlers who had endured the hardships of droughts, tornadoes, and harsh winters found that they could not withstand the unrelenting force of the floods, which seemed to hit with increasing regularity. The constant battle to protect crops, homes, and livestock from the storms left many families feeling disillusioned and defeated. For many, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s was the culmination of years of suffering caused by droughts, unpredictable weather, and the fragile relationship between settlers and the land they were attempting to tame, and doors to avoid being engulfed in the choking cloud of dust. These storms could last for hours or even days, and they would leave everything covered in a fine layer of dirt, from furniture to food, known as black blizzards. These dust storms were so intense that they could engulf entire towns, reducing visibility to near zero. These storms were created when strong winds lifted loose soil from the dry earth, creating a suffocating cloud of dust and debris. Blizzards, powerful snowstorms with fierce winds and freezing temperatures, would sometimes strike without warning, trapping entire families and wagon trains in their homes or on the open trail. These snowstorms were so intense that visibility could drop to zero, and roads could become completely impassable. For the early settlers in mountain regions, the winter months were the most dangerous. Isolation was a serious issue. Towns could become completely cut off for weeks at a time, as snow drifts and frozen rivers made travel impossible. The effort to stay warm, especially in homes with poorly constructed fireplaces, could drain the energy of even the hardiest settlers. But beyond the physical toll, these blizzards carried a psychological weight. The constant isolation and long stretches of snowbound days caused deep feelings of despair for many. Settlers would sometimes go days without seeing another person, leading to a kind of social withdrawal. During these periods, families had to rely on stockpiles, salted meats, dried vegetables, and whatever else could be preserved from the previous growing season. For those who had underground cellars or access to canned goods, survival was somewhat easier. But those who were less prepared could quickly run out of food. Blizzards could also take a physical toll, making everyday tasks, like chopping wood or caring for livestock, nearly impossible. In many ways, the mountain winter served as both a test of survival and a test of mental resilience. Dust storms and the challenge of the plains on the Great Plains. The opposite extreme posed its own threat to settlers. Settlers, particularly those farming in the Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas areas, learned quickly that the land's soil was fragile. The dust storms of the plains had significant long-term effects on the settlers' ability to grow crops. In addition to the physical effects, the dust storms also took a toll on the mental well-being of the settlers. Floods, waters, ferocity, and the risk of deluge. While snowstorms and tornadoes struck with sudden and intense violence, floods were often just as dangerous, though they had a gradual and persistent impact. Floods were especially devastating because they struck with little warning and often left families with nothing. The psychological toll of dealing with floods was equally damaging. The weather of the Wild West was not just a backdrop to the drama of frontier life, it was an active participant in the struggle for survival. Despite the dangers, settlers and pioneers persevered. Their ability to adapt to the weather's extremes was key to their survival.